Chapter 877. Su Lu stood up and continued to provoke Qi Dabing, who was sitting across the table, with his deliberately cold expression and crazy words. His calm gaze was like the surface of a lake that had not been blown by the wind, but it also showed signs that it could move at any time. When his gaze landed on Qi Dabing's coat, it was as if he could see the gun inside. The man across the table was very strong. Although Su Lu had won twice in the underground sewer and in the auto repair factory, he would never underestimate this person. The royal blood in Qi Dabing's body was somewhat thin, but it was still enough to support him to cultivate 8 Qi. What made Su Lu even more vigilant was that he was another student of Fengyu. If measured by data, this man should be the strongest man in the younger generation after the 3. How could he knock him down without alerting his subordinates outside the room? Su Lu repeated Mad Dog's declaration in a cold tone, but his mind was doing fast calculations. He knew that he had to be fast. After calming down his opponent's mind, he would succeed in one strike. He was like a stray dog wandering by the side of a mine. When he saw food, he would rush up with ferocious determination and bite down hard, never letting go. When he just spat out the word, rot, from his thin lips, his hands calmly pressed on the table, his shoulders slightly lowered, and his body relaxed. When there was no sign that he was going to make a move, he suddenly made his move. The 5 fingers of his right hand suddenly spread open like the torn pages of a fan. With a whoosh, he grabbed the teacup in front of him. Qi Dabing seemed to be stunned by his fierce words, but in fact, he had been calmly watching all the subtle movements of his body, especially the teacup in front of him. So the moment Su Lu made a move, he made the fastest reaction. He didn't call for his subordinates outside the room in vain. Instead, he used his right hand as fast as lightning to pull out a pistol and aimed the black muzzle between Su Li's eyebrows. His index finger was on the trigger, and he didn't hesitate to press it down hard. He was very clear about Su Li's ability. He knew that once he made a move, it would be a matter of life and death. Therefore, his actions were very straightforward, without any hesitation. He didn't care about the consequences at all. He just wanted him to die. When the cold gun barrel was aimed at the space between Su Li's eyebrows and was about to shoot, Su Li's 5 fingers had just touched the edge of the teacup. His fingertips could only feel the coldness of the tea that penetrated the wall. It seemed that death was imminent. However, Su Lu never thought of using the teacup in front of him to buy time. His target was the teacup across the table, the one that also contained the cold tea that belonged to the dead Tang Zhizhong. An invisible force whizzed out from his fingertips and instantly broke through the distance between the table and accurately hit the small porcelain cup. Accompanied by a crisp sound, the teacup seemed to have received some kind of shock and jumped up in fear. It whistled through the air and viciously smashed into the black hole of the muzzle. Pa! With a dull and monotonous sound, the bullet shot out powerfully, but it was far away from the target. The tube-shaded green tree in the corner suddenly shattered. Qi Dabing's pupils shrank as he looked at the figure that swept across the table like a mad tiger and whizzed toward him. He made a calculation in his mind like lightning. He knew that if he tried to aim at the opponent again, the elbow strike that seemed to carry countless tons of weight would definitely smash his head into a rotten watermelon. He released his right hand that was tightly holding the gun and focused all his spiritual power on the left side of his body. In an instant, he bent his left arm and used his arm to protect his cheek. The tip of his elbow fiercely met the attack. The 2 people's elbows collided with each other without any fancy moves. The powerful force that was hidden between the bones and flesh took advantage of the momentum to burst out, causing the air to vibrate uneasily. However, Su Lu took advantage of the momentum to pounce on Qi Dabing fiercely with a 70% domineeringness. He actually smashed Qi Dabing into the wall and forced him to take 2 steps back. Without any pause, Su Li's left foot heavily stomped on the ground. His body leaned forward in an extremely aggressive manner, and his left arm unreasonably hit the opponent's neck, which was the weakest part of the opponent's body. The 2 movements were extremely simple, and there was no obvious distinction between the 2 movements. The 10 postures that he had learned since he was a child had long melted into his blood and nerves. In today's world, there were not many people who could be his opponent in close combat. Even someone as strong as Madman Li had been defeated by him in terms of techniques when they were in Linyuan. If Qi Dabing's iron-like arm were to hit him, his neck bone would definitely crack. However, to Su Li's surprise, although Qi Dabing was pushed back in an extremely embarrassing manner, he did not know when, but his right arm was raised horizontally. In an almost impossible situation, he directly blocked Su Li's extremely domineering chop. The collision of the powerful forces once again shook the space. The leaves of the pipe-shade green tree that was in a state of collapse began to fall off the branches in the silent wind that suddenly appeared. Su Li's pupils shrank slightly. His opponent seemed to have guessed what his next move would be in advance. No, it should be said that Qi Dabing's body instinctively sensed what his next move would be. In an instant, he thought of a very important problem, and his mood suddenly became a little cold. His opponent was Feng Yu's student, so he must be very familiar with these sharp and terrifying close combat skills. He might even have practiced them for a longer time than him. Because of his cold mood, his fighting spirit increased. Su Lu expressionlessly crossed his legs and directly approached Qi Dabing. His 3 fingers formed a thorn, and with a strange twist, he went straight for his opponent's throat. Qi Dabing, who was very close to Chu Yunsheng, narrowed his eyes. He raised his right knee to protect his lower abdomen, and his left palm turned into an iron door, blocking his throat. Like a blunt knife cutting into the old skin of a rhinoceros, or like a thick dictionary hitting a person, Su Li's fingers fiercely cut into Qi Dabing's palm, making a muffled sound. Purple blood seeped out from his palm, and his knuckles also became a little pale, and it was difficult for him to go any further. The battle continued. Elbow to elbow, knee to knee. In the extremely narrow space near the window, the 2 people were doing the sharpest and most ruthless close combat in the smallest area. The air was torn, rolled, and then torn again. Every part of their body became a terrifying weapon. No matter if it was the elbow, the knee, the snap of the fingers, or the head, they were all like steel and iron, piercing each other like needles. All of them had the blood of the Empire's royal family flowing in their veins. They all had the same teacher, close or distant. All of them had inherited the close combat skills of the Li family of Philadelphia. They were either fierce or ruthless. This kind of battle was definitely not very exciting to watch, but it was definitely the most dangerous melee battle. This kind of battle started suddenly, and often ended very quickly as well. It was even faster than the people involved could imagine. The pistol left Qi Dabing's hand, and at this time, it finally fell to the ground, making a crisp sound. Su Lu and Qi Dabing's bodies approached each other in a strange posture. Their right legs were like steel, deeply embedded into each other's center of gravity. Then, the 2 twisted their knees at almost the same time. Their feet still didn't leave the ground, but their knees fiercely hit each other. The dull sound of collision suddenly sounded, and the pants on the 2 people's knees shattered at the same time. They didn't know how many times the 2 iron knees had hit each other in a flash. Qi Dabing's face was pale. He felt the sharp pain coming from that place and knew that the knee's cartilage had been broken. His body leaned forward powerlessly. However, this accidental change that seemed like he had lost his balance and could only admit defeat gave him an opportunity to turn the situation around. He suddenly bent his right arm and used the height difference to avoid Su Li's left arm. He drew the straightest line in the air and used the tip of his elbow to fiercely smash Su Li's shoulder. Su Li's left shoulder seemed to have an extra mountain. He seemed to hear the surface of his shoulder blade crack. His waist and abdomen couldn't withstand such a huge force. His left leg suddenly went soft, and he squatted down. However, his eyes were still bright as he stared in front of him. Whoosh! Taking advantage of the squatting position, Su Lu pulled out the military knife hidden in his boot at lightning speed and fiercely stabbed it into the open and defenseless chest in front of him. With a poochie sound, the delicate and sharp military knife pierced through Chi Dabing's palm that had come to block him based on his battle instinct. It stabbed into his waist and directly cut through the muscle fibers in that area. It even pierced through the vertebrae behind his waist and directly broke his nerve bundle. Almost without any pause or hesitation, Sulu pulled out the military knife as fast as he could and once again stabbed it diagonally into Chi Dabing's body. The military knife accurately pierced through the gap between the ribs and the soft lobes of the lungs. The sharp tip of the knife reached the edge of the heart. At this time, the intense pain from the nerve bundle was transmitted to Chi Dabing's brain. His face was extremely distorted. He instinctively wanted to scream, but it was blocked by a thick and strong palm. "Don't scream." Sulu half squatted on the ground and looked at Chi Dabing, who was leaning against the wall and slowly sliding down. His left hand covered Chi Dabing's mouth so hard that his veins were exposed. With a poochie sound, Chi Dabing spat out the blood that he had been holding in his chest. He quickly took a few deep breaths, and his pale face slightly recovered. The sharp military knife in his right hand was still deeply stabbed into Chi Dabing's body. The scene looked a bit bloody and strange. Chi Dabing's face was ashen as he leaned against the wall. He looked at the military knife under his ribs with the corner of his eyes. He imagined that the sharp tip of the knife could pierce through his heart at any time. He was terrified and started to cough. Blood spurted out of his mouth from his lungs to his trachea like fireworks. He forcefully swallowed a mouthful of sweet saliva and looked at Sulu, who was squatting in front of him. He said with a trembling voice, "You can't kill me. No one knows where she is. If you kill me, you will regret it for the rest of your life. Tell me where she is." Su Li's hand that was holding the military knife was very stable. Even if Chi Dabing coughed violently, he did not let the tip of the knife pierce through his heart. He said, "If you don't tell me, I will kill you. If I tell you, you will still kill me." Chi Dabing smiled bitterly. "For the same reason, even if I agree to your conditions, you will still kill Auntie." Sulu said, "If that's the case, I might as well kill you first and then go find her." Chi Dabing fell into a great panic. He had never thought that there would be a person in the world who would not be threatened like Sulu. He clearly cared about that fat woman so much. Why did he dare to do this? Su Li's expression suddenly became serious. He covered his ears with his left hand and said, "You found her? Inform them." Then he looked at Chi Dabing and said an address. Hearing this address, Chi Dabing's body stiffened. He knew that he could no longer use Susan to threaten this small-eyed man. He rolled his eyes in despair and suddenly said hysterically, "Teacher will not let you kill me. Don't forget that I am also teacher's student. We are from the same school." After a moment of silence, Sulu said with an expressionless face, "You are his student. I am just a worker. As for the same school, we are from your mother's school." After saying this, he pushed his right hand and the sharp military knife directly pierced through the man's heart. Chapter 878. Sulu pulled out the military knife. His face was still expressionless, but when he heard the spluttering sound, his brows slightly furrowed. Chi Dabing's throat made a gurgling sound as he gasped for breath in vain. His legs twitched, and he died. Blood gurgled out from under his ribs. Not long after, it stopped because of the loss of vitality. The red sun outside the window was already setting. Sulu stood up and looked back. He saw that around the streets of the capital, there was a stretch of plain gray buildings. As usual, it was monotonous and dull, but it was as if someone was looking at him. Then, he looked back at the closed door again. Outside the corridor, there were Chi Dabing's loyal subordinates, Tang Zhizhong's body that was gradually turning cold, and the resistance members in their respective rooms who still didn't know what had happened. Without spending too much time thinking, he grabbed the edge of the small window with his right hand and directly jumped down. Falling through the air, the light red light of twilight flashed quickly over his body. Sulu silently thought about how Chi Dabing had asked him to jump out of the window to escape. He killed him, and now he still wanted to jump out of the window to escape. The difference between the two was probably that the former was forced to leave, but now it was his own decision. Whether there was any annoying resistance or pressure had always been an important basis for him to decide the direction he wanted to go. His feet landed on the ground with a muffled thud. Sulu silently climbed over the wall. Before he turned the corner, he subconsciously looked back at the auto repair factory building. He could vaguely see many figures shuttling between the buildings in panic. If he left quietly like this, the resistance would probably think that he killed Tang Zhizhong and Chi Dabing. Moreover, there would definitely be an intense power struggle within the organization. However, this was ultimately something he didn't have the ability and qualifications to deal with. Imperial 2nd Royal Hospital, Back Mountain Intensive Care Unit. Sulu hurriedly arrived by helicopter. He pushed open the blue door and quickly walked to the side of the bed. He reached out and held the hand of the woman on the bed. His mood finally calmed down. In the instant before he killed Chi Dabing, Philip searched the database of the Imperial Intelligence Agency and used 3 near-Earth military satellites to conduct a high-density scan of suspicious locations around the capital. He finally succeeded in finding the place where Aunt Susan was imprisoned, a remote ranch in the suburbs. Sulu had Philip notify the Imperial Intelligence Agency. The agency's Special Operations Forces were already on standby. Now that they had the specific location and the enemy's layout, they parachuted into the ranch like tigers and wolves. It didn't take much time to rescue the ant, and no one died in the entire operation. It was just that Aunt Susan had caught a cold the night before and was greatly frightened today. Her body was very weak. After she was rescued, she was directly sent to this luxurious royal hospital, and she was injected with sedatives. And At this time, she was in A, and she was slowly receiving a high-energy nutrient fluid. Sulu looked at the ant's white hair that was messy on the pillow and reached out to gently tidy it for her. He noticed that the ant's brows were still tightly furrowed in her sleep. Her dry lips trembled from time to time, and she used some kind of dialect to lightly mutter words that were difficult to understand. He couldn't help but frown. At this time, the door of the ward was pushed open. A middle-aged man in a black official's uniform walked in with a cold expression. He had a luxurious staff under his arm. Behind him followed 6 or 7 stern-looking subordinates. The officials in charge of the ward's security all bowed to the side and didn't dare to stop them. It seemed that he was a big shot. Sulu slowly stood up. Looking at the man who was getting closer and closer, he suddenly said, "I have a patient here. Whatever you want to say, go out first." Obviously, this big shot who called himself Commandery Prince Jinzhang didn't have the leisure and time to sympathize with the patient. Thinking about it from another perspective, as the Commandery Prince, who was personally appointed by His Majesty to temporarily lead the affairs of the Intelligence Bureau while Huai Chaoshe was in charge of the front-line battle, he had been blinded by the anger of being neglected. He didn't consider why there was such a sudden action today that he didn't know about. "What's your position in the Bureau? Who approved this action?" The Commandery Prince looked down at Sulu with 1% of his eyes. He didn't do it deliberately. He naturally looked at Su Li's face and scolded in a deep voice, "I will naturally punish you after the matter. What I want to know now is, where is the base of the rebel organization? Why were you able to escape from there alone? Tell me everything you know right now." Sulu frowned and quietly looked at this member of the imperial family. He roughly guessed that the high-ranking officials in the Intelligence Bureau had used some unknown method to hide their identities. Their intention was none other than to let the Commandery Prince meet with him. Realizing that he actually dared to frown and look at him impatiently, Commandery Prince Jinzhang snorted. His eyes were extremely round. He was probably going to kill someone in the next moment. Sulu ignored him and directly turned to walk out of the ward. After everyone left the ward, he suddenly turned to look at the Commandery Prince and said, "I don't want to talk too much with you. I'm just doing my business." However, to avoid trouble, I can tell you that in my eyes, there has never been anything like a commandery prince or prince. If you have the same idea as me and don't want to cause too much trouble, I suggest you ask the people around you or the staff in the intelligence bureau about the specific situation. In reality, these words were long-winded enough. However, because Sulu was unwilling to have too much contact with the imperial officials and was even more unwilling to reveal his identity and shout about the glory of his family like a noble young master in a confrontation on the street, he would rather remind the commandery prince and let him investigate on his own. Ever since he was a teenager, he had not liked to play this game of relying on his father. Back then, he had been an orphan in a mining family and did not have the right to rely on his father. Now that he had the most powerful father in the entire universe, he did not want to acknowledge him. Commandery Prince Jinzhong narrowed his eyes slightly. The expression on his face changed continuously because of this person's calmness. He stared at Su Li's face. Suddenly, he took a phone from a subordinate and asked a few questions. After hanging up the phone, the commandery prince no longer had his initial arrogance. His eyes were filled with an extremely complicated expression. He looked at Sulu silently for a long time and then said, "The emperor summons you to the palace." Sulu paused and then said, "Not now. I will go when I have time." Because he owed a favor to the imperial royal family for this matter, his answer at this moment was already as gentle as possible. However, when it fell into the ears of everyone in the corridor, it was still like rolling thunder. He dared to directly refuse the great emperor's summons and say that he would go when he had time. Commandery Prince Jinzhong looked at him like a monster. He had wanted to use this opportunity to scold him as an elder. Suddenly, he thought of this person's past glorious deeds. He thought of how the most hard-working prince of the empire, the most bloodthirsty commandery prince, had been unreasonably killed by this small-eyed man in front of him. He immediately gave up on his previous thoughts. At night, Aunt Susan woke up. Sulu stayed by her side and comforted her with a few words. Looking at Aunt Susan's haggard and sunken eyes, he did not explain too much and quietly urged her to go back to sleep. After Aunt Susan relaxed and fell into a deep sleep, Sulu walked out of the ward and came to the verdant garden at the edge of the building. He looked up at the strange moon in the sky and lit a cigarette. He sank into a complicated and confused mood and was silent for a long time. The royal hospital was near the mountains and rivers. The scenery was excellent, especially in this special protective area behind the mountains, where only those with noble titles could live. It was built in the valley and welcomed the rising moon and sunset through the plum trees. It was so beautiful that it was like a dream that he did not want to wake up from. He thought of everything he had experienced during the day and guessed what was happening in the car repair factory. He thought of how he was now far away from that place as if nothing had happened. He saved Aunt Susan and strolled in the beautiful plum forest. He felt that it was really like a dream. Elder Tang Zhizhong's words kept echoing in his mind. The longer they echoed, the more the scenes and suggestions were like poems in a dream. They gradually faded and faded. Although he did not forget them, they became more and more vague. Become the king of the left sky star region. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the bright moon hanging high in the dark blue night sky. He admitted that he was tempted at that time in the room, otherwise he would not have been silent for so long. Just like what Li Pifu said on his sickbed, Feng Yu went to Donglin in the past partly because he wanted to witness the tragic beauty of the decline of a society and civilization. To be able to witness some kind of big change in history was an irresistible temptation. Who did not want to go back to the beginning of time and see Schiller write wonderful works? Who did not want to go back to the beginning of history and see the Tai dynasty peacefully give up power and the scene of thousands of people celebrating at the beginning of the Republic? Becoming the emperor of the empire, witnessing a big change in the left sky star region that had not happened for tens of thousands of years, and even personally participating in it, this temptation was too great. It was so great that even he, a rock in Donglin, found it hard to suppress his desire. However, the sudden change in the situation and the cold situation caused by Qi Dabing made him quickly realize that the plan of the resistance organization could not change the world of the left sky star region. This kind of reform path from the top to the bottom would eventually lead to the old path of war and slaughter. No one would be willing to give up the rights and interests they already had, let alone the entire class of the imperial family. That Prince Jinzhang he saw earlier might be afraid of him because of his bloodline and did not even have the courage to oppose him inheriting the throne of the empire. However, if he carried out the agreement with Tang Zhizhong, this prince would definitely resist at all costs. Su Lu could not even imagine what kind of attitude Huai Chaoshi would have when the time came. In comparison, the current imperial family of the empire tried to use education to bridge the gap between the classes, which seemed more gentle and feasible. However, how could this kind of scratching through the shoe stop the pain of hundreds of millions of years? The bright moon hung high in the sky and the plum trees were fragrant without flowers. He walked slowly in the back of the mountain of the hospital, the cigarette between his fingers gradually burning out. He thought for a long time but still could not figure out why. He could not help but laugh at himself and admit that he was indeed a little stupid in this regard. Chapter 879. Star-seizing Palace was very tall, so tall that it reached into the clouds. Su Lu walked through the streets of the capital, looking at the building that overlooked the mortal world. He always unconsciously did not understand why the countless bloody rebellions of the empire had never harmed this seemingly slender and fragile symbolic building. Why had the successive emperors who lived at the very top been accompanied by the stars at night? Why had they not been able to cultivate a broad heart? More importantly, where had the empire obtained the technology from so many years ago to be able to protect that environment? Standing behind the internal official, he felt the gentle movement of the floating elevator. Because too much time had passed, he had been silently thinking about these things. Only when the elevator doors silently opened and that screen covered in golden sunflowers came into view did he suddenly wake up with a shiver. The emperor of the empire, Huai Fuchai, was sitting against the wall on the couch. He wore a fitting black and purple robe, with a belt of round stones tied tightly around his waist. Paired with the stone ring that bound his straight white hair behind his head, it gave him a particularly solemn and dignified feeling. Su Lu walked up behind him and said, "Thank you for yesterday's matter." "You?" Huai Fuchai slowly turned around and looked at him coldly. "This is the education you received in the Federation." "In my impression, the Federation has always believed that the people of the Empire are barbaric orcs, so why is it that you, who they taught, do not know how to speak respectfully to your own father?" Su Lu maintained his silence. He did not explain anything, nor did he want to refute anything. "What did you say when you met with those trash yesterday?" Huai Fuchai looked at him with slight mockery. "They really want you to be emperor? And then after I die, they will throw the empire into chaos?" Su Li's gaze lowered slightly. In a low voice, he said, "The current empire is already in chaos enough." Huai Fuchai's sharp brows furrowed slightly. He looked at him coldly and suddenly said, "Since you do not bend your waist for power, since you loathe the smell of the imperial palace, why did you meet with those trash? Or is it that a trash like you is also moved and wants to take over everything in my hands?" The first two sentences were from that day outside the palace walls, the contents of their conversation in the wild graveyard. Su Lu slowly raised his head and calmly looked into his eyes, saying, "I have never thought of myself as trash. Cowardly and cowardly. He only has brute strength, but his shoulders can't carry anything. He can see the entire universe, but he has to deal with those rat-like trash. He looks at his father's back like a thief. If this kind of person isn't trash, then who is?" Huai Fuchai unceremoniously reprimanded him, "I really don't know what you've learned from Nasri. You didn't even learn his arrogance. True arrogance lies in the lack of fear, nothing else." Su Lu was silent for a moment before replying, "If saying bad words in front of you is courage, then I've already said enough dirty words when you whipped me with the thorns in your hand." As if recalling the extremely unpleasant scene of the past, Wai Fu Chai slowly furrowed his brows. He recalled that it was he who had whipped this little guy in front of him until he was covered in blood and ordered him to be killed, but he had no idea that this was the only bloodline he had left in this universe. With this thought, Wai Fu Chai's anger grew. Perhaps even he himself could not tell where this anger came from. From being deceived. Coming from a loss of face. In short, he slowly straightened his body. With the cold demeanor of a sovereign, he narrowed his eyes at Su Lu and said, "You are already old. You are already old. I don't want to educate you anymore, and I don't want to talk about responsibility with a piece of trash like you. But you must remember, the blood of Bai Yan's Hui family flows in your body. You are my son, you are my subject, you must maintain the respect that you deserve. In the category of thinking that I can accept, there is no such thing as a ruler and subject, father and son." Su Lu looked at him and said, "So please don't try to use this to intimidate me. Since you are not willing to kill me, then don't use this tone of voice to speak to me." Ever since he had ascended to the Star-Seizing Hall, no one had dared to use this tone of voice to speak to the Emperor of the Empire, not even his most trusted and favorite Huai Chaosher. Wai Fu Chai's eyes narrowed even more sharply as he gloomily stared at Su Li's face. Suddenly, he raised his right hand and slowly stroked his white hair. His expression changed from the calm before the storm to its usual indifference. With undisguised mockery, he said, "Yes, an idiot like you will only fall for Pabre's tricks." Su Lu slowly clenched his fists, not to attack, but to control his emotions. He simply did not want to meet this man in front of him. Although in terms of blood, he was his father, the reason he did not want to do so was not because of fear or anything else, but simply because he did not want to. Wai Fu Chai calmly looked at his tightly pursed lips. For some reason, his emotions once again relaxed. After a pause, he said indifferently, "This time I helped you, but you killed that traitor Qi Dabing, so we are even." Hearing these words, Su Lu was somewhat puzzled. He was well aware of the extent of the Empire's infiltration of the so-called rebel organizations. The harvest that year was the most bloody proof, so he did not believe that the rebel organizations under the leadership of Qi Dabing could pose any threat to the imperial family. Do not underestimate any enemy, even if it is an enemy that has already died in front of you. Wai Fu Chai waved his hands slightly. His black and purple sleeves fluttered behind his back. He expressionlessly walked to the railing and said in a low voice, "That bastard is lucky to have the blood of our imperial family in him, and he has the necessary personality to succeed. In my opinion, if he had not met you, he would have had a very good future." Su Lu silently followed him to the railing. Thinking of Qi Dabing's declaration in the room that was like grinding steel, thinking of those stormy statements about the theory of evolution, he could not help but frown slightly. He thought that if that person was given a chance, perhaps he really could have grown into a character like Pabre. But people with ability often think too highly of themselves, and people who think too highly of themselves die easily because they always feel that they are fated and will not die so easily. Wai Fu Chai slowly walked to the railing and extended his left hand to caress the intricate patterns on the railing. He looked at the white clouds drifting outside the building and said with a calm expression, "However, I am the only one truly fated in the entire universe. Since childhood, countless people have tried to kill me, but I am still alive. As a monarch, I have to have unworldly self-confidence, so I have never worried that the battleships of the Federation will be able to destroy this star-seizing hall. The stars in the universe move and the clouds move, but this palace always exists. I can't even see any possibility of it dying." Wai Fu Chai looked at the white clouds flowing outside the railing, at the place where the blood-stained thorn fell, at the clouds where his elder brother had fallen. After a long silence, he continued, "If you think about it carefully, I do not have many regrets in this life, other than Li Pifu dying too early. That day, when I heard that he had died, I suddenly realized that I could not find an opponent. Do you understand that kind of loneliness? Sulu looked at the somewhat melancholy back of this monarch and couldn't help but think of some of the special literary descriptions in Schiller's novels, but he couldn't laugh no matter what. The same words, when spoken by different people, had completely different effects. If it was a hedonistic son sighing about his loneliness, it would only make others feel annoyed and disgusted, but the man who said this was the master of the left sky star region, the man with the most authority in this part of the universe, so it was only right and proper. Huai Fu Chai's face carried a faint hint of self-mockery as he sighed emotionally. In the eyes of many people, and in your eyes, this battle before you is hair-raising, but in my eyes, it is nothing more than a game. These little fellows are messing around, do I have to participate? After father and master passed away, I waited here for Li Pifu for 20 years, but in the end, he hid by that lake and refused to come out. Since he is dead, where can I find an opponent? Su Li's brows rose slightly. But many people have already died. People will die. Li Pifu will die, I will die, you will also die. The fate of people is death, and the reason people live is because they want to live to the fullest. Huai Fu Chai turned to look at him. I am an emperor, I do not have the right to the fullest. Since you want to go to the fullest, I will not stop you. But you must remember, no matter where you go, no matter what you do, my blood flows in your body. Your glory and fall will be draped in the name of the Huai family. Even if you are going to die, you must find a way to die that will not disgrace me. On the way out of the royal palace, Sulu silently thought about the seemingly meaningless conversation in Jiaxing Hall. He didn't feel much emotion or sympathy for the monarch who had guarded the royal palace alone for decades. He only thought about how this monarch clearly had a vision, willpower, and determination that ordinary people could not reach. He might even have great power that was no less than Li Pifu's, but because of that obsession that crossed his heart and made him unable to be happy, he waited his entire life only to see Li Pifu die of old age. Just how much meaning did such a life have? And what was the meaning of his own life? Muan was waiting for him outside the palace gates. He looked with some surprise at this underworld boss who was still wearing black fur. He narrowed his eyes and asked, I heard that you are now a special official of the Bureau of Intelligence. My rank is very low. Although I have the protection of Her Highness, you also know that the various departments are filled with nobles and even members of the royal family. It is not easy for a commoner like me to rise up the ranks. As if he didn't see the emotions in Su Li's eyes, Muan smiled and walked side by side with him under the shade of a tree. He said, looks like you don't plan to stay in the royal palace? Yes. I'm not used to many of the details of life here. Su Lu turned his head and glanced at the official who was still respectfully kneeling on the ground outside the palace gates. He said, for example, this kind of scene. He and Muan had a friendship forged through a hail of bullets. Although they had gone through life and death together on the valley road to the south of Tianjin and had worked together to bury the bodies of many soldiers from the resistance organization, given his temperament, he was still unable to let go of Muan's betrayal. However, he had now become someone who had no right to speak of his position. Naturally, he had no right to criticize others. Or rather, it could be said that he had lost some sort of confidence. Muan keenly sensed his true emotions and said with a slight self-deprecating smile, I am not the emperor's son. Saying such words in the empire was, without a doubt, a heinous crime. The person who said it could wash their neck clean and summon all the women and children in their family to wash their necks together. However, Muan said it so indifferently. Su Lu also understood. He paused in his steps, shook his head, and patted his shoulder with a smile. Chapter 880. This had nothing to do with the theory of bloodlines, but it was related to the innate inequality of human society. Su Lu recalled what Huai Chaoshi said back then and couldn't help but laugh at himself. Humans hated betrayal because it brought about extreme insecurity. It was always the hardest to defend against a sneak attack from one's companions. Therefore, no matter whether it was the Federation or the Empire, the punishment for traitors was always the heaviest in all the moral codes. For example, Mu'en right now, but it did not include himself. The noble blood of the Bai Jin Hui family flowed in his body. When he turned from a hero of the Federation to a crown prince of the Empire, even many people in the Federation did not think that it was a betrayal. They only thought that it was a melodramatic arrangement of fate. However, in the Empire, there was absolutely no one who dared to mention or even think about how many young people of the Empire he had killed on the battlefield and even assassinated members of the royal family. If he was just an ordinary person, he would have been killed by countless cold words and blades when he had cold-bloodedly betrayed the Empire and then shamelessly betrayed the Federation. Understanding this, one could understand Mu'en's helpless choice a little more. Under a big banyan tree by the road, when the two were about to say goodbye, Mu'en asked, "What do you plan to do in the future?" "A few days ago, I told someone that I don't have any choice right now. I can only hope that the two sides can stop fighting. This really has nothing to do with morality, justice, or humanity. To use a perhaps inappropriate analogy, this war to me is like a father and mother picking up a kitchen knife and hacking each other at home. What can I do as a son?" "You're right. This is a natural choice." Mu'en patted his shoulder sympathetically. After thinking for a moment, he said directly, "I may be going back to the organization soon. At that time, I may need to use your name." "You're going back?" Su Lu frowned and asked, "Now, including the Federation, everyone knows that you're a traitor. How are you going to go back? Tang Zhizhong and Qi Dabing are already dead. You should be able to guess that the people in the organization will attribute their deaths to you. My mission back in the organization is to use the evidence provided by the Intelligence Bureau to expose Qi Dabing's true colors. Who will believe the evidence you provide? When it comes to things like evidence, you can believe it when you need it. For an organization that has fallen apart and is being cursed by countless people who originally supported them, the most important thing now is to survive. As long as the evidence can give them an excuse to change and survive, they will believe it. Can you make it clearer? Under the direct command of His Highness, I will lead the entire resistance organization and carry out extensive cooperation with the royal family to establish a united front to resist the invasion of the Federation." Mu'en said calmly, "I believe that most of the comrades in the organization will agree with this approach." Su Lu shook his head and said, "There are two people that the resistance group hates the most. One is the dead Keaton, and the other is Hui Chaoshi, who leads the intelligence agency. They will never agree to cooperate with her. I'm not talking about the princess." Mu'en smiled and said, "I'm talking about you, the crown prince." Holding the fruit knife with steady fingers, he cut the thin skin. Since he could repair the delicate structure with his naked eyes and hands, it was very easy for him to cut the apple. Almost in the blink of an eye, 7 rings of thin skin were gently peeled off. He held the white apple like a lantern and brought it to Aunt Susan's mouth. Aunt Susan looked at him with a smile and shook her head to show that she didn't want to eat it. Her expression was still haggard. She looked at him quietly and asked, "Little guy, who are you?" Hearing this question, Su Lu knew how to answer. Whether it was when he was escaping in the small courtyard or when he came back this time, Aunt Susan could sense his difficulties and rarely asked him about these things. In fact, he could have directly stated his identity and believed that Aunt Susan wouldn't treat him differently because of this. But when he thought of her current physical condition, he didn't want to shock her too much. Thinking of what the doctor said earlier, his mood was a bit gloomy. The results of the comprehensive medical examination were not very good. The delicate noble lady of the past had become an auntie in the market with her arms akimbo. Behind the dramatic life were too many hardships of life, especially the hardships in the early years, which had caused great damage to Aunt Susan's body. Now, with the addition of the cold and fear, all of it broke out. Although it wasn't life-threatening, she needed a long time to recuperate. "I work in the intelligence agency." "Well, I should be considered a not small official." Su Lu smiled and replied, those criminals who kidnapped you mainly wanted to take revenge on me. It's my fault for involving you. You have already apologized many times." Aunt Susan looked at the black hair under his brown hair, coughed twice and said with concern, "Is the palace no longer investigating you? You have to continue to dye your hair. Otherwise, it will be terrible if people see it." "I'm not a fugitive." "What are you afraid of?" Sulu rubbed his hair and explained, "Dyeing my hair is mainly for convenience." Aunt Susan sighed and said, "Little guy is always lying. This is the second royal hospital. If you are just an ordinary official, how can I live here?" "You know." Sulu replied in embarrassment. "Don't forget, I was also a lady of a noble family when I was young. Although I was not qualified to see a doctor in the royal hospital, I came with my parents to visit a great noble. Even now, I haven't forgotten the beautiful plum forest in the back mountain." Aunt Susan looked at him and smiled. Sweet memories of her teenage years flashed across her chubby round face. "I said that I have a good relationship with the princess," Sulu said with a smile. Aunt Susan's expression suddenly dimmed. She gently grabbed his hand and said, "There is still no news from Paul. Can you help me ask?" Sulu was slightly stunned. He remembered what he heard that day and nodded. Although not all the senior officials of the empire knew who Sulu was, they soon had an answer close to the truth in the name of the intelligence department, but the answer was not a good one. The reason why Paul's allowance had not been transferred to Aunt Susan's account was indeed because there was no electronic signature of him. The reason why Paul did not sign was not because he had no time to care about this matter when he was patrolling the front line with His Highness, but because he was missing on the front line. Sulu frowned as he looked at the latest missing person list sent by the military. Looking at the eye-catching name at the bottom of the page, the smiling face of the Empire youth in the small courtyard that year appeared in his mind. He had served in the federal military for many years. He knew very well that the so-called missing person list often meant the list of the dead. However, because the bodies of the soldiers were not found, or under the heavy firepower of the enemy, they were directly turned into fragments nestled together with the mountains and rivers. For the sake of Auntie Susan's health, he was not going to tell her the news. However, Auntie Susan's observation skills, which she had developed over the years in the slums, played a role at this time. She looked at the worry in Su Li's eyes and spent the middle of the night forcing the truth out of him. When Aunt Susan was a young girl, her family was destroyed. When she was a little older, her brother joined the West Woods Expeditionary Army. He wanted to earn military merits to restore the glory of his family, but unexpectedly, her brother never came back. It was not until decades later that she got the bad news that he was buried in a foreign land and a broken diary. After getting married, she could have lived a simple life, but her husband who loved her was taken away by illness. Her life always fell into despair when she saw the most hope. Life was unfair to her, but she was strong. She stubbornly survived with her young son in the most dilapidated slums of the empire until she heard the news that her son was missing on the front line. The endless pain and darkness instantly crushed Aunt Susan's spirit. Her body, which was already extremely weak, rapidly lost weight. In just 2 days, her cheeks were deeply sunken. She could only lie on the bed helplessly and sadly, staring blankly at the sky outside the window that was filled with the scent of plum trees. Sulu silently accompanied her, watching Aunt Susan move step by step toward death. He gently held her face, feeling the touch that was much thinner than before, and said with a smile, "It's good to lose weight. When Paul comes back and sees a more beautiful mother, he will be very happy." Aunt Susan moved her lips with great difficulty, looked at him with a smile, and said in a hoarse voice, "These days, it's been hard on you. You don't have to make me happy again." "I'm not making you happy." Sulu stood by the bed, looked at her face, and said calmly, "You have to live, because I will go to the front line to find him. I promise you, as long as he is still alive, whether he is captured by the federal forces, abandoned in the valley, or lost in hell, I will bring him back alive and bring him to you." The words were very calm, but there was a kind of firmness that made people have no choice but to believe it. It was like a stone silently smashed into an annoying wet mud. There was no earth-shattering sound, but it smashed a deep hole that was difficult to erase. Some kind of brilliance slowly appeared in Aunt Susan's eyes, the brilliance of life. She gently held Su Li's finger with a trembling hand and said, "I promise you, I will not die, but you have to promise me one thing." "I will bring him back, don't worry," Su Li replied. "No, I want you, promise me, you can't have anything happen to you." In the early morning, in the suburbs of Jingdo where the morning light had just woken up, Su Li, carrying a backpack, walked silently in the fields with Zhong Huiyan, who he had picked up from the great master Fan Manor. "Brother, are we really going to Mo Hua planet?" "Yes. I remember that day in front of Auntie's grave, you said that you wouldn't go to that place until you could solve a certain problem." "Yes, I miss the Federation very much, but I can't go back. I can't even see those people from the Federation, because I still can't find a way to solve that problem." "Have you found it now?" "Maybe soon. But still not." "Yes, but I found a reason to go to Mo Hua planet." "What reason?" "I like Paul. He is kind and cheerful. Of course, he also has a bellyful of untimely hot-bloodedness. He is a very good young man of the Empire, just like those very good young men of the Federation. I like Aunt Susan. She is a good person. Good people should live a long life, just like those kind-hearted aunties of the Federation. There is no reason for such a person to die because of war." Chapter 881. In front of a beautiful mangrove forest, Zhong Huiyan stopped, looked up at him and asked hesitantly, "But so many people have died because of the war in the past, but you have been hiding far away. Don't you think this is unfair?" Su Li stretched out his hand and rubbed her hair. He said softly, "Everyone has their own considerations. I just said that I am looking for reasons. Reasons are often excuses to convince myself. Auntie and Paul are closer and more important to me, so this excuse seems more powerful." Zhong Huiyan shrugged and continued to speak out the doubts in her heart. For example, on that planet full of killing, there were originally Xiong Lin Quan and other former companions. Why didn't you go? The morning light of the awakening spread from the horizon and sprinkled on the mangrove forest behind the two. The dewdrops on the thick red leaves sparkled like diamonds, reflecting the surrounding red scenery and adding a bit of charm. Su Li looked at the camouflaged spaceship at the edge of the woods. Suddenly, his expression froze. After a moment of silence, he patted the girl on the shoulder and said, "You go up first." Zhong Huiyan frowned slightly and glanced at the mangrove forest subconsciously. She roughly guessed what the situation was, but she trusted Su Li unconditionally. She would never be a burden like those noble ladies who only knew how to scream and tremble, so she didn't say much and walked over calmly. Watching the spaceship remove its camouflage and slowly close the heavy hatch door, Su Li loosened his finger that was holding the trigger and slowly took his hand out of his pocket. He turned and calmly looked at the depths of the mangrove forest, the place in the dark and beautiful scenery. It had been nearly 3 years since he left the Federation. He had been traveling in the Empire for a long time. That person had never appeared, but he knew that the other party would appear at certain times. He had killed Qi Dabing, and the story of that person's deep roots in the Empire had come to an end. Presumably, he would come out to express regret or anger. Because of this mental preparation, Su Li's mood was very calm at this time. He was not nervous. Of course, he kept the necessary vigilance. Although their relationship was good, who knew if the other party would go crazy? Feng Yu walked out from the depths of the forest with a slight smile. His weathered face appeared a little gentler under the light of the red leaves. Only his mouth full of yellow and black rotten teeth were exposed frivolously. Facing the gradually brightening morning light, it showed the ugly details. Can a cold-blooded animal like you really live for 1,000 years? Su Li fished out a box of cigarettes from his jacket pocket, took out a windproof lighter and lit it up. Then, he threw the cigarette and lighter over. At this time, there was still a distance of about 10 meters between them. Feng Yu lit the cigarette and took a deep breath. The white smoke with a hint of light blue blew out from his nostrils. Then, it strangely rolled around his face and refused to disperse, blurring his eyes. Feng Yu's eyebrows slightly raised. He looked at the rising red sun and said, "I taught you. You were clearly a citizen of the Empire, but you always thought of the good of the Federation. You watched your former subordinates go through fire and water, but you hid thousands of light years away. When it comes to cold-bloodedness, you have long surpassed me. As for hypocrisy, you are somewhat similar to that old man who already died." Su Le knew that the old man he was talking about was the military god Li Pifu. He shrugged indifferently and said, "Uncle, I've read a lot of books in the past few years. Even if I can't fully understand some of them, I still memorize them in a clumsy way. However, there's a passage that I didn't read recently. When I was young, you had me go to the library of Heshi State University to read, and I copied it down." Without waiting for Feng Yu to ask or mock, Su Le continued, "The backwardness of a society is first and foremost the backwardness of the elites, and the most obvious sign of the backwardness of the elites is that they often criticize the backwardness of the people. Although you, who played the role of George Carlin, never said this, you have always done this, whether it was in front of the Federation or the Empire. I remember that this is a famous and correct line of nonsense said by a certain famous Federation politician." Feng Yu smiled and said, "I'm just curious as to why, when we rarely meet, you've become one of those boring middle-aged men, habitually making this kind of judgment. Because, although we rarely meet, I've always been thinking about what I should say if I did meet you. Or rather, I've always been thinking about what kind of person you are, wandering the universe in countless incarnations. The Emperor of the Empire has his goals, although that goal no longer exists. The great teacher has his own goals, although they are somewhat literary and somewhat sour. The military god also has his own goals, although they are somewhat unyielding. Even the aunties who sell children's clothes in the market have their own goals, although they are specific and subtle. But what about you? What exactly is your goal?" After a moment of silence, Su Le slowly spread out his hands, feeling the slightly cold morning breeze. He did not hide the part of his heart that had cooled down. Looking at Feng Yu who was not far away, he sighed and said, "I've thought about it and realized that your goal is only playing. You have the ability to resist the charter. You see yourself as a god above all. You just find these things interesting, that's all." The corner of Feng Yu's lips curled up slightly. Looking at him, he said mockingly, "Does this count as a concrete manifestation of a child's patricide complex in psychology? Your disappointment in me is only because you need to use a certain method to prove that you have already surpassed me, that you can easily defeat me. Only in this way can you complete this process. No, I don't want to defeat you or surpass you. I'm not Qi Dabing. I've never believed in the theory of evolution. I just want to tell you one thing." Su Le looked at him and said calmly, "Tang Zhizhong and the others want me to become the emperor. I know that this matter definitely has something to do with you. You want to see whether Qi Dabing or I can make your idea come true. In order to know this, you can even coldly watch us kill each other in the room. I don't like this. Also, don't expect to play me like you played the people of the Federation or like you played Qi Dabing." The morning light shone on Feng Yu's face. After a moment of silence, he said with a smile, "I know very well that he is no match for you. However, I only have 2 students in my life. You really shouldn't kill him. I'll repeat myself. I'm just an employee." Looking at the smile on his face, Su Le raised his eyebrows slightly and said, "He wants to kill me. Why shouldn't I kill him? I can't be bothered to care about that guy's existence. What meaning does it have to you? Over the years, many people have told me that there is no reason in the universe. Since you old guys have forced me into a corner, my fist is reason." Feng Yu bent his finger slightly and flicked the cigarette far into the red sun. He said calmly, since we're about to leave, let's get to the point. Don't bother me in the future. Sulu said, if you're tired of playing and don't want to go through all this trouble anymore and want to go back to the Donglin sanatorium to find a girl, I'm willing to go with you. I'm very good at paying for prostitutes. However, if you still want to play with me, please forgive me for not being a toy. When the time comes, I don't know what I'll do. At this point in the conversation, Feng Yu slowly furrowed his brows for the first time. Under the reflection of the morning light, one could clearly see that there were traces of silver in his brows. As he furrowed his brows, his seemingly unchanging middle-aged face finally gave off a sense of age. Little guy, are you threatening me? Perhaps you're doing this for my own good, but the problem is that I don't even know if you're doing this for my own good. You're hard to trust, probably because we're two different kinds of people. Sulu threw the cigarette butt to the ground and slowly extinguished it. He then raised his head and looked into Feng Yu's eyes. He continued, 3 years ago in the Federation, your biggest question was how I got in touch with the charter computer. In fact, the reason is very simple. It's because of the biggest difference between us. I'm used to trusting people. Even if I've been hurt before, this attitude has never changed. I can even trust the spot of light in the black dream, the active contact signal sent by the charter computer. But you're different. You're used to being suspicious and wary of humans, let alone the glory of the charter, which you hate and are wary of the most. Although the specific situation back then was different, it was essentially because of this reason that I established active contact with the charter computer, but you lost the most important opportunity. Sulu looked at Feng Yu, who seemed to be deep in thought, and said, we can't anymore. That old thing underground in the Federation Bureau of Proclamation building has become much smarter than before. We can no longer enjoy this kind of benefit. He changed the topic and continued, for the past 3 years, I've been wandering among the stars, imagining the years you spent back then. I realized that the difference between us is really quite big. We're both wandering, but I have companions. I have little Watermelon to accompany me. If I want, I can even find 4 or 5 girls to accompany me. He smiled slightly, thinking about Philip. Feng Yu frowned slightly. Although he was already an old man, he was still a man after all. He could allow Sulu to spout nonsense in other aspects, but in this aspect, he refused to admit defeat even if he was beaten to death. He said contemptuously, if I want, I can find 4,000 or 5,000 women to accompany me. You don't dare, not you don't want. Sulu spread his arms and said, I'm different. I dare, but I don't want. Feng Yu gently stroked his stubbled cheek, looked at him, and said, are you done? If you're done, I'll leave first. Otherwise, I won't be able to catch the bus to Las Vegas. Sulu was silent for a moment. He looked at him and said seriously, Uncle, although you still look young and handsome, and your butt is still so perky, you're actually very old. There was a long pause. You're about to die. Can you stop fooling around? Feng Yu was slightly stunned. He smiled and said, did you forget what I told you in the mine? Of course, I won't die. I'll never die. After saying this, the teacher and student, the boss and the employee, who had a strange relationship, went their separate ways in silence. Sulu stood on the slightly wet mud, looking at the back of the figure that disappeared into the depths of the mangrove forest. He was silent for a long time, thinking about something. Then, he heard the sound of a farewell wind chime. He knew that it was the string of 6-star knives hanging behind the uncles, but that was beating rhythmically. After this farewell, he didn't know when they would meet again. Chapter 882. In the late autumn of the 75th year of the constitutional calendar, a cold wind began to blow in the capital. Although the first snow had not yet arrived, the low temperature outside had begun to paint the glass windows of the building with frost. A very slight electric current starting sound was heard, and the automatic heating equipment below began to operate. It only took a few seconds for the glass window, like a woman with a face mask, to become clear. The flat evergreen grass and the withered leaves rolling in the autumn wind created a feeling of a mixture of tenacity and decay. Through the dark and steady face on the glass, it slowly seeped into the official residence. President Pabre silently looked at the scenery outside the window, and suddenly said, "Where is the parade? We just entered the territory of Nank." Mr. Breen, the director of the office of the president's residence, glanced at the electronic notebook in his hand and calmly replied, "The officials sent to the headquarters of the 3 industrial unions of S2 have been working for nearly a week. According to their judgment, nearly 60% of the ordinary workers still firmly support you, but most of the leaders of the 3 industrial unions have already been bribed by Macho. This is the personal action of Mr. Tai Ziyuan, don't associate it with Macho." President Pabre slowly turned around, his body was extremely relaxed as he leaned on the windowsill and calmly said, "Refusing to inherit the crystal mining consortium is naturally the biggest bribe in the history of the Federation. But what will that lady think? The foundation of the Qiancher Tai family disappeared just like that. Even if Macho is the president for 10 consecutive terms, I'm afraid it will not be able to recover the loss." Director Breen slightly smiled, respectfully stood behind the president, and handed over the electronic notebook in his hand. What will Lady Tai think? Those who were qualified to discuss in the Oval Office of the official residence had already received the news through the most reliable channel that Madame Yi smashed the entire kitchen in a rage several months ago. To be able to make this lady who was accustomed to the picturesque scene lose her composure, one could imagine what kind of heavy blow Tai Ziyuan's decision had caused to her. The ambush in the Straits of Mo Hua Planet achieved the greatest victory. Even if Shaoqing was not at the front line, the gift he left for the princess still played a role. He is indeed a rare talent. A steady voice rang out from the corner of the Oval Office. It turned out that General Li Jiedu had been sitting silently in the shadows and had not spoken. When will Shaoqing come back? President Pabre picked up the coffee on the table and looked at his old friend. The fleet has completed the space jump. It will take at most 3 weeks, Li Jiedu replied. President Pabre slowly took a sip of the black coffee thoughtfully. His thick black eyebrows furrowed slightly, and then gradually relaxed. He was not worried about the silent march. He had enough experience and countermeasures for the civil rights movement. In the parliamentary election 2 years ago, the candidates of Pabre's faction won many seats. Now, the various bills were being passed one by one according to the design of that year. And as long as Du Shaoqing returned to the capital ring with his military might, those bills and regulations would be passed even faster. More importantly, it would bring him more glory and prestige. The noose around the necks of the 7 families was getting tighter and tighter. All the movements in the back of the mountain were in sight, and all the situations were under control. President Pabre turned to look at the cold autumn outside the window. A faint smile appeared on his dark face. He knew that he only needed to wait for the right time to pass the wartime presidential re-election bill and be the president for another 5 years. Then, he would be able to push forward the business of the tavern to the end. But why did he always feel that there was some shadow in his heart that could not be dispelled? President Pabre frowned slightly. He put down the coffee cup without knowing what to feel. Then, he heard a light beep from the table. He picked up the electronic notepad and looked at the latest news report. The expression on his face became more and more serious. His dark skin gradually became gloomy until it turned into a dripping lead cloud, making people not dare to look directly at him. With a bang, Pabre slammed the table heavily. He stared at Director Breen and said angrily, "Did you read today's Capital Daily News?" The Capital Daily News, which had a very high status in the hearts of the Federation people, temporarily stopped publication 3 years ago because of a fire. After it resumed publication, the newspaper seemed to have lost its keen observation and the most scarce objective point of view of journalists. It was almost the same as the media that were busy reporting on the front lines all day long but were unwilling to mention the internal affairs of the Federation. Until one day in the late autumn of the 75th year of the constitutional calendar, the Capital Daily News used a special issue to announce to the entire Federation that it had truly resumed publication. And chief editor Bob and reporter Wood, who had won 2 Nebula Awards, once again stood in front of the public and pulled back a corner of the dark curtain without fear. The title of this special issue was extremely sensational: The Gravedigger of the Federation. Who was the gravedigger of the Federation? The 7 notorious families that had been hidden in the dark history for thousands of years? The imperial people who were as ferocious as beasts in the Gary Corridor and vowed to destroy the Federation? Or the germ-carrying rats that the HTD Bureau of the Federation couldn't completely eliminate no matter how they cleaned up? No, the answer provided by the Capital Daily News to the entire Federation was beyond everyone's expectations and shook everyone's nerves. Because they believed that the gravedigger of the Federation was President Pabre, who still enjoyed a very high reputation, and the Federation government under his leadership. This special issue used a full 4 pages to help the Federation people look back to the time and space of a few years ago. They recalled the big explosion that had gradually been forgotten by people, the Westwoods Military Region Commander-in-Chief Zhong Suahu and his wife who died in the explosion, and thousands of Federation soldiers and soldiers. As the writer, reporter Wood gave up the sharp and ruthless style he was best at this time. Instead, he calmly used 23 pictures, a pen stroke that was so calm that it seemed to have no emotion, a dry but soul-stirring explanation of the incident, and a large relationship tree diagram on the front of the special issue to tell all the readers. Colonel Lake, former Westwoods Military Region, provided the precise route and time of the return of the ancient belt to Colonel Shiman Jean of the Iron 7th Division of the 2nd Military Region. Colonel Shiman Jean provided this information to the Empire Ghost Fleet that was preparing for the first raid through an Imperial spy named Hiyuyu. When the Empire Ghost Fleet forcibly passed through the space passage of the Gary Corridor and entered the Federation Star Sector, they passed through 47 astronomical units without being discovered by the Federal Fleet. That was because they obtained the data of the corridor between the remote star sector, the glory of the Charter, and this data was collected and provided by the current director of the Bureau of Proclamation, Cui Zhedong. The middlemen were still Colonel Shiman Jean and the spy named Hiyuyu. Then, the clear relationship tree diagram closely connected the names of Shiman Jean, Hiyuyu, and Cui Zhedong. Then, the branches gradually spread out, and the names of the 2 senators appeared. The name of the director of the Princess Office of the President's Residence appeared. The name of the former Vice President of the Federation, Mr. Li Jiedu, Chairman of the Federation's Joint Chiefs of Staff and Commander of the 1st Military Region, and the name of the former Commander-in-Chief of the Federation's enemy, Du Shaoqing, appeared. The special issue of the Capital Special District Daily titled, Who is the Gravedigger of the Federation, did not embellish or hide the above information. It did not use the titles of certain officials or military officers, nor did it use any vague guesses. Instead, it directly confirmed and pointed out the name directly. At the top of the relationship tree diagram, at the top of the whole page, there was a black frame next to the 3 big words, Gravedigger. There was no photo or name in it. But all the people of the Federation who saw this newspaper knew who it was. On the back page of this special issue, the editor-in-chief of the Capital Special District Daily, Bob, wrote, I believe that those of you who read this special issue can clearly read the thoughts of me and reporter Wood from the pictures and evidence. Yes, we officially accuse President Pabre and the government under his leadership, as well as the Trinity Association, which is said to have gathered the most intelligent elites of the Federation, of conspiring to kill the bravest general of the Federation with the help of the Empire. Perhaps no one believes this accusation, because when feelings are frustrated and trust is damaged, people are often more willing to believe that this frustration and damage is a conspiracy. Then, I suggest that you read our investigation report carefully again, instead of angrily tearing it to pieces. This evidence is not fake, and the source is not suspicious. The person who found the evidence is dead and bears some very heavy charges, but reporter Wood and I believe him, because he helped us expose the true face of Senator Macklin, and he used the evidence of his death to prove the reliability of this evidence. The person who handed us the evidence once reminded us that we need the right time to release this evidence, otherwise it will only disappear under the angry spit of the people and the strong suppression of the government. Is now the best time? No, now is not the best time. The war between the Federation and the Empire is still going on, and the attention of the entire society is still stuck on the war-torn planet Mo. Even the demonstrations of the 3 industrial unions in the 4 mountainous states do not seem to be able to stir up much waves. But we can no longer wait, because we have watched the government seize the power that is not granted by the law step by step through various acts under the pretext of cracking down on the 7 families. We have watched as the fanatical Padre doctrine has blinded the eyes of too many people and reverberated in every building in the capital like hot air. The various departments of the government use the Evil Patriotism Act to arbitrarily expropriate resources and arrest people, ignoring the law. What is even more frightening is that the government has become accustomed to relying on secret departments and psychological intimidation to maintain its legitimacy. We really can't wait any longer. The longer we wait, the more depraved the Federation will become. Mr. Padre still has more than 2 years left in office. Do we still have to wait for 2 more years? He has been trying to get Parliament Hill to pass a bill and complete an unprecedented 3rd term in office, so will there be a 4th? Then do we have to wait forever? That is why we published this investigation report, not because now is the best time, but because now is already the Federation's last chance. Chapter 883. In the spring of year 67 of the constitutional calendar, during the Nebula Award ceremony for Senator Medellin, I heard President Padre say this. A person dying is not as good as a lamp going out. A lamp has light, but the place it cannot illuminate is darkness. If one does something wrong, one must pay the price. Perhaps I am not a mature politician, but I am a firm believer of the Federation's laws. If I die, you can dig up my grave and see what color it is. I also have the same attitude towards some people who have died. Back then, Senator Medellin had just died in an assassination. The people did not know that he would be the future seat of the infamous empire. Back then, Mr. Padre had just taken office as president, full of vitality and beautiful ideas to change this world. Without hiding anything, I was also one of his most loyal supporters back then, just like you all who are reading this newspaper right now. However, just like what Mr. Padre once said, if one does something wrong, one must pay the price. As the Federation's president, every one of us has the right to ask him to stand on the side of the moral divide. Moreover, what he did already crossed the line of morality. We have no intention of supporting any political movement, but we insist that the people should have the right to know the truth. Will our accusation affect the war in the left sky starfield? Will our demands make the soldiers on the front lines shed more blood? I do not know the exact answer. I only know that in this war between the Federation and the Empire, if there is some kind of justice that can be said loudly, then it can only be that we have a better system than them. The people who live in this starfield believe in kindness, justice, conscience, and law. If the Federation that the frontline soldiers protect loses these precious qualities, then what is worth their blood and sacrifice? Vice President Byron is dead, Colonel Lake is dead, Colonel Shiman Jean is dead, Mr. Senator is dead, many people have already died. There is no way to confront them, because even if we dig up their graves, the only answer we can obtain is silence. However, there are even more people who are still alive. They did not accept the judgment of the law or anger. They coldly sit at the highest level of the Federation, high above, ruling this world, changing this world. I don't know what color their graves will be when they dig them up, but we know that if we don't stop them, then the entire Federation will be buried in an ice-cold grave. Written by Bob and Wood in the autumn of the 75th year of the constitutional calendar. The Capital Daily News had long since moved away from the newspaper street that was filled with the smell of ink in his imagination. Now, it was just a very ordinary building in the western part of the capital. However, the eye-catching sign of the eclipse of the moon still hung at the entrance of the news agency. Although it had been burned away by the fire, it still existed. In the room behind the huge sign of the eclipse of the moon, reporter Wood rubbed his leg and concentrated on reading his report for the fourth time. After the traffic accident, although his leg had recovered very well, every time it was cold and gloomy like today, it would ache unbearably. I still think that the last paragraph shouldn't be added. The justice of this war cannot be questioned. No matter how vague you write it, it will give the other side a good excuse. Chief Editor Bob sat behind his desk and smiled. He gently wiped his glasses and said, "This is very likely to be our last article in the news industry. I have to be willful for once." At this moment, the black phone rang. Wood glanced at him worriedly, but his expression didn't change. He calmly picked up the phone and said, "What did the board of directors say?" The chairman on the other end of the phone coughed twice and said in an even voice, "Mr. Lee wants to talk to you." On the other end of the phone, the president of the Sanlin Bank, Lee Shouju, said in an undisguised voice of praise, "Mr. Chief Editor, you don't have to worry. We will protect your safety. The special issue will be fully printed." After hanging up the phone, Chief Editor Bob spread his hands and looked at Wood. He said, "The boss of the boss seems to have a lot of opinions about the government." For Bob and Wood, the boss of the newspaper company, the giant Sanlin United Bank, had decided to fully support the newspaper company in its war against the Federation government. This was not a very difficult puzzle for them. They didn't want the newspaper company to participate in the war between the government and the seven families. In fact, before publishing the news that shocked the Federation, they, who had independent editorial rights, didn't have any contact with the board of directors. Therefore, at the emergency hearing on Parliament Hill later, when faced with the aggressive questioning of a certain member of Parliament, Chief Editor Bob smiled and didn't admit to any of the accusations. According to the News Information Confidentiality Act and the Citizens Privacy Act, I refuse to explain the source of the evidence to the hearing. In addition, according to Article 4, Section 27 of the Charter, news reports are never required to bear the burden of proof. If the parties involved in the report believe that the report harms their rights and interests with false facts, they can file a lawsuit. Please note that this is a private prosecution case. Chief Editor Bob's expression was serious. He looked around at the political bigwigs in the Parliament Hill and said, "If Mr. Pabre accuses the newspaper company of slander, even though he is a lawyer and I am a web novelist, I still welcome a lawsuit with him." A radical member of the Pabre faction, who had just been elected to Parliament, angrily took off his boots and slammed them on the table. He shouted at him from more than 10 meters away, "According to the Patriotism Act, you must answer honestly and without restrictions. Otherwise, you will be severely accused. I want to know what you can accuse me of." Chief Editor Bob pressed down on the shoulder of the enraged Wood, stared at the Member of Parliament, and asked in a harsh tone, "The Patriotism Act? From the first day this act was passed in Parliament Hill, I was not ready to accept it. In fact, as a citizen, I have filed a lawsuit with the Supreme Court. I think this act seriously violates the Charter and should be revoked immediately." The hearing was temporarily adjourned. Wood brought him a glass of water and looked at the members whispering around him. He said with a smile, "Tai Ziyuan has also been trying to reverse the case for the ancient clock ship. They have provided information to major newspapers, although not as detailed and reliable as ours. But no newspaper company dared to publish it. Why? Because they are afraid of death. But to be honest, I am also afraid. When you are not afraid of death, you usually won't die. Because if you die at this time, then they have no way to explain this matter clearly." Chief Editor Bob said, "But although you won't die, I think you will definitely be scolded." In the cold late autumn, it was still rain instead of snow. When the rain fell on the long stone steps in front of Parliament Hill, it didn't take long for it to turn into pieces of round ice, making the stone steps extremely wet and slippery. Chief Editor Bob and Wood walked out of Parliament Hill with umbrellas. They supported each other as they walked down the stone steps. Their movements were extremely clumsy. The two walked to the bottom of the stone steps with difficulty. What greeted them were countless flashing lights and microphones, as well as the insults of the agitated people, such as traitors, running dogs, and dog excrement. Chief Editor, I heard that the Board of Directors of the Capital Special District Daily has been secretly receiving financial support from the Sanlin United Bank. So, does your report today have anything to do with the government's investigation of those big families? After all, they were in the same profession, so the way they asked the question was relatively gentle. But the reaction of the surrounding crowd was even more intense. They crumpled the newspaper in their hands into paper balls, threw them in anger, and shouted loudly to beat the running dogs of the evil Lee family to death. Under the protection of the police, Chief Editor Bob and reporter Wood withstood the attack of paper balls that were denser than the raindrops. They shrank their bodies behind the umbrella, looked at each other, and showed a bitter smile. Amid the banging sounds, Wood angrily cursed, "Scold all you want. Just for my half-crippled leg in the rain, I will take Pabre down." Chief Editor Bob let go of his hand that was supporting his elbow. With one hand holding the umbrella with difficulty, he put the other hand into his windbreaker and fumbled for a long time. He took out a thick cigarette and handed it over. He smiled and comforted, "I think the protesters in Nank State will definitely not scold us. They love us very much." Under the long stone steps of Parliament Hill, the cold rain in late autumn fell on the black umbrellas, making patter sounds. The angry crowd threw paper balls that fell on the umbrellas and bodies, making patter sounds. In such a miserable environment, the two reporters hunched their bodies and began to taste the high-quality coarse tobacco that was flown in from Naha State. The blue smoke and the aroma gradually filled the air. The black umbrellas were suddenly opened by someone. Bob and Wood, whose mood was interrupted, frowned and looked at the several officials in black overalls in front of them. They asked, "What's the matter?" "Let me introduce myself." The leader of the officials wiped the water droplets on his forehead and said slowly, "I'm Inspector Chen Yijiang from the Federation Government Joint Investigation Department. Please follow us back for investigation." Chief Editor Bob looked at the man with a wooden expression and saw the raindrops on his glasses. After a moment of silence, he asked, "What's the reason?" Chen Yijiang was slightly startled. He took out a document from his pocket and slowly read, "Your report promotes the Empire and destroys the Federation's preparations for war. You are suspected of treason." The silent march had been going on for almost half a year. The protesters who opposed the Federation government and demanded that President Pabre resign and be investigated gradually grew like weeds in every district of the Federation. Because of the military control of the capital airport, the 3,000 marchers from the 4 states around the mountain chose to walk from the port city to the capital. The crowd walked slowly and silently along the famous high-speed rail line. They gathered when they came across towns, held concerts when they came across mountains, cheered when they came across police, and whistled when they came across beautiful women. On the road, there were always people who got lost. The silent march seemed absurd and relaxed, but in fact, it was extremely well organized. It even asked the people who participated to not leave any garbage behind them. The combination of the Grand Carnival and the strict political demands made many people choose to leave. However, on the way from the port city to the capital, there were many young people who were dissatisfied with the current situation of the Federation, or simply wanted to add a touch of absurdity to their life resume. The number of people didn't decrease. Instead, it snowballed more and more. Late at night the day before yesterday, the parade entered the territory of South Cuzhou. This morning, the total number of people was more than 20,000. They wore black masks and began to walk along the main road of South Cuzhou's capital. Occasionally, they would dance silently. Except for the sound of their footsteps and rhythm, the silence was terrifying. Chapter 884. A red flower was reflected on the gray glass, and then it was clean and otherworldly, exceptionally beautiful. Lai Ziyuan moved his gaze away from the bright red and looked at the crowd of demonstrators walking silently on the street. He didn't speak for a long time. Although the two of them used to play together at the same table when they were young, and they even had some kind of hidden engagement, after so many years of strange and gaudy things, they had long become peaceful. Exactly 3 years ago, in the autumn of the 72nd year of the constitutional calendar, this kind of familiar scene appeared in the Federation. He looked at the crowd walking silently through the streets of the capital of South Kazhou and said with emotion, "It's just that the big demonstration that shook the entire universe was for the president to establish his authority and deter the opposition forces of the 7 families. Today's demonstration is to pull him down from the stage." Zhou Yu gently pursed her lips and looked at the newspaper in her right hand. She frowned slightly and asked, "You've read the special issue of the Capital Special District Daily. What do you think?" Lai Ziyuan shook his head and took a sip of the water in his cup. He coughed twice. "I'm very puzzled. Where did Bob and Wood find the evidence? It's exactly like the Macklin case. When everyone only had a vague judgment and looked for evidence in vain, they quietly detonated a bomb in the Federation." Zhou Yu looked sideways at his pale and thin cheeks. After a short pause, she continued, "We've been silently marching for half a year. Neither you nor I can find such a powerful thing. Don't you think it's strange?" "It's not strange." Tai Ziyuan said, "You said that the situation is exactly the same as when Macklin was investigated. So it's obvious that these things were left behind by Su Lu before he left. As for the guy who found these things, I've also seen him." He quietly looked back at Zhou Yu's charming eyes, as if he wanted to confirm some facts that no longer existed from her reaction. But in the end, he didn't get a response. After a moment of silence, he continued, "Chief Editor Bob also mentioned that he's dead, but I believe that even if Shi Qinghai is dead, he will leave behind enough foreshadowing before his death to make his enemies suffer." Hearing the name that she hadn't heard for nearly 3 years, Zhou Yu's expression didn't change at all. Her charming and beautiful face was still like a proud red flower in the cold wind, but her right hand holding the wine glass was slightly pale. Then she turned around and calmly looked at the silent crowd under the window, not letting Tai Ziyuan see her eyes. Tai Ziyuan glanced at her side face, then looked at the crowd under the window. He picked up the glass and drank a mouthful of water, then turned around and walked back to his desk. His eyes swept over the debris in the wastebasket, and he said, "In the past 6 months, the general strategy of the election headquarters has been made by you. I have to say that I admire the excellent planning ability you have shown, so I have never objected to any of your proposals. But not this time." He raised his head, looked at Zhou Yu, and continued, "This proposal is too violent, and we are the ones who initiated the violence." Being directly denied by Tai Ziyuan, Zhou Yu's expression still didn't change. Looking at the crowd of demonstrators who were slowly walking to the downtown business district like ants under the window, she said, "Without blood appearing on the TV screen, there is no way to touch the numb hearts of the people. Without violence, there is no revolution. You should be very clear that any mass movement will eventually enter the cycle of violence. If we don't prepare well and take the initiative, then we will only be blown by the wind and beaten by the rain and become a joke in history." She slowly turned around and looked at Tai Ziyuan indifferently. The glass of wine in her hand was as red as blood. In history, the young people's revolutions were rarely successful, because their thinking was too simple, too naive, and too idealistic. As the leader of this movement, although you are also young, you can't make the same mistake. Tai Ziyuan raised his hand to stop her explanation. He said with a smile, "You don't have to explain too much. I know the real purpose of you choosing this radical proposal better than these 400 staff of the campaign headquarters. You still want to intensify the current situation and force that person to appear before Du Shaoqing comes back. But you made a mistake." The smile on Tai Ziyuan's pale and thin face gradually disappeared. He rubbed his tired eyebrows and said slowly, "You overestimated Su Li's influence or ability. No matter how powerful his combat ability is, or how sensitive his identity is, he is only one person after all. He can't change the general situation. Even if he is still the same person as before, what can he do when he sees the Federation fall into chaos and sorrow and appears in front of us? And don't forget, he is still a person of the Empire. He is the son of the Empire's emperor. We haven't seen him for 3 years. No one knows if he has enjoyed kinship or not in the Empire. No one knows how the throne of the Left Sky Star region will change him, but we know that he is a person of the Empire, so he is an enemy. You have to be clear about this. As his best friend, you should know what kind of person he is, so you said indifferently. Unless one is a real stone, anyone will change, especially when he has suffered a mental attack that normal people can't imagine. Tai Ziyuan calmly and firmly ended the discussion that had yet to truly begin. When it comes to things like violence, although it cannot be avoided, it must be controlled. If we blindly incite the emotions of the people and incite class conflict, then what is the difference between us and the Macklin of the past and the Pabre of the present? Hearing this, Zhou Yu was silent for a very long time. Although she didn't say anything, it was equivalent to expressing her agreement. As the head of the decision-making department behind the Silent March, her stance was of great significance to this mass movement that was destined to rewrite history. I've already been observing for half a year, but because I've never been to the front lines of the protests, I've never been able to understand how you turned the surging flood in the streets and fields into this cute and bouncing stream in front of the window. She looked at the extremely orderly procession below the window, at the calm smiles emanating from the black masks in the distance. Frowning, she asked in confusion, "We all know that when there are too many people, there will definitely be some uncontrollable accidents. With tens of thousands of people walking in the fields and cities for so long, there will definitely be some uncontrollable accidents. Moreover, the hot-blooded youths naturally have their own demands and desire for leadership. In an environment like this where desires can easily be magnified, how can you make them maintain such obedience? Moving people with emotions, convincing them with reason, and enticing them with benefits." Tai Ziyuan calmly said, "Anyone in the procession who wants to stand out and break the rules is nothing more than wanting to obtain more benefits, political or economic. Therefore, every time I find such people, I'll use money to knock them out in advance and then drive them away." He walked to the window and pointed at the applauding citizens of South Kazhou on both sides of the street. He continued, "In fact, you should be very clear on why the procession is always welcomed by the citizens. Apart from the fact that the procession maintains order and doesn't disrupt their lives, the more important reason is that these citizens know that once the Silent March succeeds and Pabre is forced to resign, they will be able to obtain a large amount of income." Zhou Yu placed the wine glass on the windowsill and looked at the crowd that was waving small flags and applauding. She thought of the press conference that had shocked the Federation half a year ago. She thought of how the weak man beside her had given away the crystal mining consortium just like that. She couldn't help but reveal a slightly mocking smile as she softly murmured, "This is truly unprecedented. Do you think that if the Empire's emperor is willing to give enough benefits, the people who are fanatical supporters of the war will suddenly collectively become pacifists? Internal affairs and war can't be compared and considered on the same platform. However, the fundamental purpose of war has always been for benefits. If the Empire can give enough resources, not to mention the people, even I won't support the continuation of the war." Tai Ziyuan looked down the window and slightly narrowed his eyes. He calmly said, "The Federation government controls too many resources, but there is one thing that they will never be able to compare to me. They don't have the money that I have. This is a simple and violent war. I want to use money to smash Pabre into the dust." What an arrogant declaration. Zhou Yu smiled and sipped the wine. "But don't forget that Madam is very angry about your decision. Many people in the big families think that your decision is crazy. The liquidity of the headquarters is running out. Are you really going to ask Miss Jian Shui'er to hold a few more charity performances to raise funds? Not everybody thinks that I, the Crown Prince, am crazy." So, it seems that the businessmen who are said to be easily blinded by benefits have a pair of profound eyes. Tai Yuan smiled and said, "Of course, the old man who is seriously ill may be a special case. Let me tell you a piece of good news. I just received a call from Li Xiaotong. Last night, a meeting was held in the manor of the Li family. The final decision was that the Sanlin United Bank will provide us with abundant and limitless assistance." Zhou Yu slowly raised her eyebrows, and an inexplicable smile appeared on her face. She said, "This is really good news. At least tens of thousands of people's boxed meals are finally guaranteed. Also, even the old man of Liyuan Palace thinks highly of you. Maybe it will affect Madame's attitude." Hearing the words, "Madame's attitude," Tai Yuan seemed to have thought of something, and his expression became a little complicated. Then, he coughed violently and held the windowsill in pain. The unhealthy blush on his pale cheeks spread like a sunset cloud. Bai Qi, a young woman in a white dress, pushed the door open and walked in. She walked behind him anxiously and gently relieved his pain. Then, she took out a pill and fed it to him. Tai Yuan smiled to express his gratitude and then waved his hand gently. Bai Qi saw his appearance and felt a little relieved. She quietly pushed the door open and left as if she had never appeared before. Only Zhou Yu noticed that she glanced at her warily when she closed the door. She couldn't help but smile mockingly. "I heard from Su Le that Bai Qi is your first woman. I really didn't expect that with your status, you would be so affectionate." "This has nothing to do with being affectionate. I like her very much. She's quiet, honest, and knows her place. Since she doesn't want to leave, I'll treat her well." Tai Yuan was suddenly stunned. He frowned and thought for a long time. He said with some uncertainty, "It seems that Su Le threatened me with this issue. Could it be that I was threatened by him? Your marriage has been delayed for 2 years. Does it have anything to do with Bai Qi's existence?" "You know very well that in the world of people like us, marriage has never had anything to do with feelings. It's just that many people in those big families think that I've gone crazy. How could they bear to marry their daughters to me? This is probably why I treat Bai Qi well. Women are troublesome, but she's an exception." Zhou Yu thought of Bai Qi's hidden and vigilant glance when she closed the door. She said with slight mockery, "Only people without abilities think that women are troublesome. This has nothing to do with ability." Tai Yuan smiled and sighed. When Su Le fought against the entire Federation, he dared to pick up a gun and kill people without any scruples. However, even someone as powerful as him couldn't do anything when he met those women of his. I think that the reason why he didn't dare to return to the Federation after escaping for 3 years might have more to do with him not knowing how to deal with those women. Zhou Yu shrugged slightly. "It's not a good habit to laugh at your friends behind their backs. Alright, then let's continue talking about the previous bribe." The effect of the drug seemed to be very fast. Tai Yuan's expression quickly returned to normal. He looked at her and said, "A critic once said that the backwardness of a society is first of all the backwardness of the elites, and the most obvious sign of the backwardness of the elites is that they often criticize the backwardness of the people. Yuzi, your current mentality already has this kind of feeling. Isn't the word elite used to scold people?" Zhou Yu looked at the people on the street below the window. She looked at the sky indifferently and directly commented, "But I do think that they are very backward." Tai Yuan replied, "If there is a so-called backwardness, it is because the channels to obtain information are not smooth. If you know more, you will naturally not be backward. For example, the readers of the Capital Special District Daily." After a pause, he added an explanation. This was what George Carlin said. At this time, he and Zhou Yu naturally did not know that in the distant Wutian galaxy, in the suburbs of the empire's capital, Su Le was unceremoniously criticizing Uncle Feng Yu, who was also George Carlin himself, as a hypocritical elite who only knew how to criticize the people for being backward. George Carlin is already dead. Let's focus on the people who are still alive. Zhou Yu asked, what do you think about this war? Have you calculated the impact of the situation on the front line? This war can't go on any longer. Tai Ziyuan directly replied with a rare seriousness, the media reports have been filtered, but you and I should know how dangerous the situation on the front line is, especially that Mo Hua planet. The war has been going on for 3 years, and the devastation of the war is unimaginable. He looked at Zhou Yu and continued, too many people have died, and compared to the benefits obtained, it is too unbalanced. The most important problem is that after paying such a high price, the Federation still does not dare to say that they will definitely win. Even if Du Shaoqing has been on the front line all this time, they still cannot win, so there is no reason to continue. The Empire's people's attitude toward war is different from ours. When faced with a dangerous situation, they can directly throw in lives, fighting with flesh and steel. However, they have more than 100 billion people. Can the Federation kill them all? Zhou Yu thought for a moment and said with a frown, as long as there are enough crystal mines, enough to support the regular cruising of 3 integrated fleets, the Federal Fleet will be able to lock down Mo Hua planet. When the Empire's troops on the surface are isolated, the Empire's rear troops will not be able to continuously resupply, and your pessimism will be meaningless. The prerequisite is that there are enough crystal mines. No one in the Federation knows the situation of the crystal mines better than I do. Tai Ziyuan said, the extraction of the crystal mines in Galaxy X is half a year later than expected because of the government's strong infiltration 3 years ago. Even if this situation did not happen, it will take at least 2 more years before it can be mass-produced. How can we drag this out? How many more people will have to die to drag this out? How could the Empire just watch this happen? When that time comes, X3 will definitely be the second Mo Hua planet. People are bound to die in war. Zhou Yu frowned slightly and said unhappily, you know that I grew up in a military compound. As a child of the military, I will definitely be mentally prepared to sacrifice myself for the Federation. If we retreat because we are afraid of people dying, then we will not fight. That will be a huge joke. Don't forget that I was once a soldier, and a very brave one at that. That is why I have always agreed that soldiers should have some kind of special rights. That is because soldiers need to kill and need people to die. They live in a different river from the normal people. Tai Ziyuan looked into her eyes. Although his speed was slow, his tone was extremely serious. But I have never believed that soldiers have a reason or obligation to sacrifice themselves for a meaningless war. This war has developed to this point, and it is no longer of any benefit to the Federation. Instead, it has become a tool to fight for glory and support for the government. This is very laughable and very sad. He pointed out the window and said, under the influence of those people in the government, and even under the influence of you and me, the current Federation's democracy has begun to become vulgar. Meanwhile, the government has already begun to become shady. Fighting for this kind of government, fighting for the survival of the government, is the greatest insult to the troops on the front lines. Something like power does indeed have some kind of terrifying magic. President Pabre has fallen too quickly, so quickly that it has exceeded my worst imagination 3 years ago. He has begun to enjoy the pleasure that power brings. Tai Ziyuan gently rubbed his forehead and said with emotion, just like what Chief Editor Bob said, the president has begun to get used to and enjoy these methods. For the Federation, this is a disaster. When secret operations reach a certain level, people will often forget what their original goal was. You all just need power, more and more power, and the more power you have, the less respect they will have. Tai Ziyuan frowned slightly. Looking at the commercial center square in the distance, he felt a faint sense of uneasiness coming from there. His voice was slightly cold as he made his final comment on the government. People who have no respect will often do anything. Because of the Silent March movement, because of the support of dozens of Federation celebrities, including Jian Shuier, and because of the various dark secrets exposed by some media and online forums, the political faction led by President Pabre suffered a sudden blow in the early elections of the various state representatives. Although the government's public support rate was still fluctuating around 57%, and Pabre's faction still maintained a slight advantage on Parliament Hill, it was conceivable that with the article in the Capital Special District Daily, the government's days would become more and more difficult. In Zhou Yu's view, Du Shaoqing leading the Iron 7th Division to carry the glory back to the country, other than symbolically adding points for the president and the government, it would be difficult for him to provide any substantial help to the current political situation. With the glory of the charter above, the military could not directly participate in political affairs. Therefore, after hearing Tai Ziyuan's comment that he would do anything, she frowned and began to think about what kind of methods the government and President Pabre would use to suppress the current wave. Don't forget the beautiful clothes that President Pabre has worn for decades. Tai Ziyuan walked to the desk, dialed a number, and reminded her, he considers himself as the spokesperson of the people at the bottom, so on the surface, there will be a lot of taboos. I believe that he will use the people to fight against the people. After that, he can calmly say that this is the choice and freedom of the people. On the floor below the two of them, the staff members were busy answering the phone. Through the close-range full-frequency communication system, they maintained close contact with the demonstrators on the streets. At the same time, they remotely controlled the dozens of groups on the ground to ensure the order of the silent march. Tai Ziyuan, who had almost unlimited financial support, had organized a team of as many as 700 people. Back when Pabre was running for president, he had done the same. As he lamented upstairs, this was just a reaction. Because of their professionalism, their efficiency was extremely high. The entire team's organization of the Silent March could be said to be perfect, especially after they entered Planet S1. The march from the port to the capital was in good order and the atmosphere was calm. Even the government-controlled official media couldn't find any problems. It had become a carnival of peaceful political expression for the people. Therefore, although the staff members were working hard, their expressions were very relaxed. At this moment, the department head received a call from the Crown Prince upstairs, followed by the first-hand news from the street. His expression suddenly became extremely serious, and the staff members who instantly grasped the situation rushed to the window in shock. With an expression of disbelief, they looked at the intersection of the 5 main streets of Nankazhou, the most prosperous commercial square. The procession wearing black masks was greeted by the citizens of the capital of South Kazhou. They waved and smiled, or waved small flags as they jumped and gathered in the commercial square. Later, they would hold a rally here to announce their demands to the people through the media. They would expose the various dark secrets of the president and his government. Even if the media was willing to broadcast, they still had a loudspeaker. Just as the sun was shining brightly, a black mass of people suddenly appeared from the street in the southwest direction. Because there were too many people, it was impossible to tell whether there were thousands or tens of thousands of people. Judging from their slightly tanned cheeks and clothes, they should be locals. In the end, it was the large banner in the demonstration team that revealed their identity. 3rd Heavy Machinery Factory of Nankazhou. Natu Engine Manufacturing Center. In contrast to the silent marching team wearing black masks, this crowd obviously came to demonstrate. As they walked, they cursed and even used the megaphone in their hands to beat the fire hydrants on the roadside, making a sound similar to war drums. Their momentum was particularly arrogant. Even though Nightmare Source had bribed all the leaders of the 3 major industrial unions, it was still unable to erase the position that President Pabre had spent his entire life to build in the hearts of the people at the bottom and the industrial workers. Now, the demonstrators that were swarming to the square from the southwest were obviously supporting the government. From time to time, shrill shouts could be heard from the demonstrators. We announce that we are officially withdrawing from the industrial unions. Shame on traitors. Long live President Pabre. Down with all the aristocrats. The Federation is not an empire. We don't welcome aristocrats. Bastards of the 7 families, get out of Nankashao. The silent march had been going on for several months. It wasn't that they hadn't encountered a pro-government protest team in the various states of the Federation, but because of the self-control of the silent march team, and also because of the effective deployment of the state police, there had never been a fierce conflict between the two sides. More often than not, they would shout and shout at each other across the railings. At that time, even Tai Ziyuan's excellent team couldn't stop the demonstration team from taking off their black masks and greeting the other side's immediate family and in-laws. But today's situation was obviously different. The pro-government demonstration team from the major factories of Nankashao clearly came prepared. Moreover, this team was clearly mixed with some men who looked out of place with the surrounding crowd. These men stared at the silent march team like eagles. From time to time, they would lower their heads and whisper a few words. Some of them were using increasingly dirty words to provoke the emotions of the workers. The spacious commercial plaza was divided into 2 areas by a fence set up by the police station. The pro-government and anti-government demonstration teams were packed to the brim, looking like a shallow sea full of sardines. The dense mass of people gave off a palpitating feeling. The pro-government crowd was cursing and swearing at the other side, while the anti-government crowd remained silent for the time being. They just collectively raised their middle fingers to express their disdain. There were some overly agitated young people who couldn't suppress their anger and vaguely shouted a few words through their black masks. The general idea was that if you have the guts, then come at me. A worker who had just learned that his younger brother had died on the front lines of Mo Hua Planet glared at the people wearing black masks in front of him with bloodshot eyes. He shouted with a hoarse voice, "You traitors! You bunch of bastards! The front lines are still at war, and you guys are messing around like this. Shameless! When Mr. President sends the 7 families to prison, and the Federation realizes true democracy, I will kill your whole family." A student who had just learned that his elder brother had died on the front lines of Mo Hua Planet furiously pulled off the black mask on his face. He rushed to the railings and roared at the worker, "Your mother is a traitor. Your whole family is a traitor. If you go to the front lines, you will be the first to kneel in front of the people of the empire. It's better for me to stab you first." Perhaps their brothers had once fought side by side on Mo Hua Planet, and perhaps even sacrificed in the same trenches. Until the moment they left this world, they were still as close as brothers. However, in the city behind them, they were threatening each other's lives for the sake of the justice they recognized, and for what they believed to be their love for the Federation. Similar curses rang out incessantly. Some people began to spit at each other, and some began to take off their pants and bare their buttocks to express their contempt and humiliation. Obscenities and petty actions at the intersection of the 2 seas of people turned into excitement and anger. The temperature of the air in the plaza gradually rose, and the situation became more and more tense. At this time, if a small spark fell, it was very likely to become a dangerous fire that burned everything. At this time, in the 2 angry demonstration teams, other than those men with gloomy expressions, no one noticed that a more dangerous situation was happening. The Nank State Police and the emergency anti-riot force responsible for maintaining order quietly withdrew from the plaza without anyone noticing. Tai Ziyuan slowly put down the phone and expressionlessly looked at the scene uploaded by the hologram. After a long silence, he explained to Zhou Yu beside him, "The state government has refused our request." Zhou Yu coldly said, "Why? Even if this is a conspiracy of the Federation government, and there are big shots pressuring them, don't they know that if bloodshed occurs in the capital of Nank State, they won't be able to explain it to the public? As long as the price is right, anything can be sold. At least in terms of official positions, the government has more resources than we do." Although Tai Ziyuan was still calm at this moment, it could be seen that his complexion had become paler and paler. It was not fear, but anger and disdain that were hidden deep in his heart. The office phone rang. The head of the emergency decision-making department downstairs reported in a trembling voice, "Mr. Councilman, the police refused to explain the reason for the withdrawal of the police force." Tai Ziyuan said with a self-deprecating smile, "They have already explained it to me. They heard that there was a fire in the southern suburbs, so all the police force was forced to go and provide support. Therefore, they can't take care of the plaza. They hope that we can urge the crowd to remain calm and not clash with the other side." After saying this, he walked to the window and looked at the plaza in the distance. It was as if he could feel the boiling hot air passing through the glass in front of him. It was so hot and pressing that it made it difficult to breathe. "They are really unscrupulous." Zhou Yu walked to his side and looked in that direction. Suppressing the anger in her heart, she took off the red flower in her hair and crushed it, saying, "The dignified president of the Federation doesn't even care about his face. Who can defeat him?" Without the police, without the anti-riot force, the crowd was filled with insidious troublemakers. There were many black-clothed figures flashing in the buildings next to the plaza. The situation deteriorated in an instant, and a chaotic battle broke out. After many years, no one could figure out which side was the first to rush over the fence, and which side was the first to throw the first punch. In fact, it was meaningless to figure it out. In the tense atmosphere of the plaza at that time, even a fart could ignite a dangerous fuse. The workers of South Kazhou who supported the government quickly gained the advantage at the beginning of the chaotic battle. After half a year of silent marching, they were clearly not mentally prepared for such a situation. When they saw the other side raise a banner and jump over the fence, the hundreds of people who were pushed to the front of the crowd were actually sluggish for a long time. A worker from S2 was surrounded and beaten by 3 people. His body shrunk in pain like a shrimp, and blood began to seep out of his mouth and nose. The black mask that represented his identity was long gone. There were shouts and curses everywhere, and the terrifying sound of fists and feet hitting people's bodies rang out. Blood filled with the smell of violence splashed everywhere as if it was free. The crowd wearing black masks tried to organize a counterattack, but they were immediately defeated by a stronger attack. In the pro-government demonstration, the gloomy-faced men took out sacks from nowhere and dumped the hard stones in the sacks on the ground. People picked them up and threw them at the opposite side. The people who couldn't distinguish between the demonstrators and the hooligans howled and fought everywhere, coldly stomping on the chests and abdomens of the other side with the tips of their feet. The stones broke through the air, and countless people in the silent march were bleeding. The formation was even more scattered, and the plaza was full of tragic scenes. The female teacher from the port city had blood all over her face. She covered her face and collapsed next to the fountain pool. Her eyes were wide open in horror as she stared at those ferocious people, but she didn't notice that there was a man with blood all over his face looking at her with evil intentions. In the southwest corner, the middle-aged uncle who had just quit his job in the suburban irrigation field was surrounded by several people and constantly kicked. He gradually lost the strength to struggle. Even though his eyes were blurred by blood, he could see the fake leather boot that was stepping on his face, but he couldn't move. In the buildings around the plaza, there were many unknown forces that were responsible for recording the scene. At this time, the cameras that were responsible for recording the scene indifferently turned around and deliberately chose the scene of the angry and helpless people wearing black masks. Further away on the street, a group of military police in plain clothes indifferently looked at the plaza. The official next to them kept talking on the phone with a smile on his face. Suddenly, a large and powerful hand reached out and slapped the phone out of his hand. Then, the hand grabbed the official's throat and turned the latter half of the flattering words he was about to say into pieces of gravel. "I hate people who are long-winded the most." When the military police in plain clothes around the street saw that their officer was attacked, their expressions changed dramatically. They reached out and prepared to take out their pistols. However, when they saw the man who grabbed their officer's throat and saw the shiny bald head, their action of taking out their pistols suddenly became extremely stiff. The bald man was 1.9 meters tall and extremely burly. His face wasn't ferocious and frightening. The subordinates behind him didn't take out a row of submachine guns and point them at the military police in plain clothes. However, the military police in plain clothes absolutely didn't dare to point their guns at him. Because he was called Zhang Xiaohua. This was South Dakota. The president wasn't the most powerful, the governor wasn't the most powerful, and the charter wasn't even the most powerful. Zhang Xiaohua was the most powerful. This was the only magical place in the Federation where a triad could be elected as the deputy speaker of the state legislature. So when Zhang Xiaohua released his palm and slowly stroked the eye-catching tattoo on his shoulder with an expressionless face, whether it was the official or the military police in plain clothes, they all felt their legs begin to tremble. Since your people aren't going to intervene in this matter, then you can just watch quietly from the side. Because my people are going to do something. Zhang Xiaohua patted the official's face and then walked toward the chaotic square. In the corridors around the square, more than 30 men in black suddenly appeared. These men accurately found the reporters who were carrying cameras, and very simply and violently used their fists to shut them up. Then, with a sullen face, they dragged their hair and walked through the corridors. I'm a reporter from the news channel. You can't do this to me. I'm from the Venus documentary film studio. You hooligans, let go of me. Neither threats nor pleas could make the men in black gentler their actions. The reporters were violently tied up and thrown into a dark room. Before leaving, the leader of the men in black introduced himself to the terrified reporters. We're not hooligans. We're triads. It was as if a magician had cast some kind of spell on the street at the southeast entrance. More than 1,000 men in black holding hard wooden sticks in their hands silently rushed toward the center of the square where the chaotic battle was taking place. A hooligan whose face was covered in blood looked at the female teacher whose face was also covered in blood at his feet. He obtained an unprecedented pleasure from her fear and helplessness. He reached out and rubbed her chest, but before he could experience the next level of pleasure, he felt a sharp pain in his wrist. A wooden stick directly smashed his arm, and then he was ruthlessly knocked to the ground. Looking at the ruthless leather boots that stepped on his face, the middle-aged man closed his eyes in despair. So he didn't see the shadow of a stick floating over, and in an even more ruthless manner, it directly smashed his leg into 3 pieces. The men in black who rushed in from the southeast entrance had cold and silent expressions. When they saw people without black masks, they ruthlessly knocked down with their sticks, causing the red ribbons on their right arms to draw a swift and fierce line. They were relatively few in number, but they were extremely ruthless and valiant. As professional thugs specially recruited from various halls in South Kazhou, how could ordinary people resist their existence? The wooden sticks were all aimed at the opponent's joints. The hard wooden sticks intersected with the fragile human bones, making frightening breaking sounds from time to time. In just half a minute, they broke through to the most tragic center of the square, and then scattered like a bomb. Countless miserable howls sounded, just like before. However, many people, especially the plainclothes police officers mixed in with the parade, felt like they were in heaven when they were fiercely attacked. Zoyu frowned and looked at the picture on the hologram. For a long time, she didn't speak. Her fingers slowly rubbed the petals that oozed red juice, and she whispered, "Did you prepare this?" Tai Ziyuan looked at her and shook his head, saying, "This is just a preparatory measure. I didn't expect it to become a reality. If you want to be a different person from Pabre, these people should have appeared earlier." Someone once said that if a person doesn't have dreams, then what is the difference between a person and a salted fish? If a person only has dreams, then what is the difference between a person and a bubble? After a moment of silence, Tai Ziyuan continued, "He is unscrupulous, so I have to have some means. A pure idealist only has one end, which is to die or be forgotten. In addition, whether or not these people will appear, and when they will appear, is not something that I can control." Then the phone rang. The man in the Federation, who had the qualifications and ability to control this kind of thing, still had the shoulders as steep as a mountain. Although his body was thin, it seemed to be full of endless strength. He was silently watching the picture on the square. In the past, when he looked up to the sky and went out, he, who regarded his family as a broken shoe, silently returned from Bermuda when his family was facing a fatal threat. When life and death were on the line, he silently returned from Bermuda. He gave up the foreign hegemony that he built for half of his life. In the midst of the storm, he carried the name of his family on his shoulders. After watching for a long time, Lin Banshan dialed Tai Ziyuan's phone and said, "When Mr. President doesn't even care about his face, what we need to do is simpler. I'm better at unscrupulous things." Chapter 885. After hanging up the phone, Tai Ziyuan took the thin windbreaker from the secretary and walked out of the room. Zhou Yu silently watched his back disappear in front of her eyes. She suddenly found that the thin body covered by the thin windbreaker was very suitable for this moment to play the role of sadness and then stir up emotions. Before walking out of the building, the public image team of the work department quickly tidied up Tai Ziyuan's appearance. The female planner with wavy hair, who was poached from a 5A advertising company, looked at Tai Ziyuan's cheeks in the mirror and urged the hairstylist to mess up his hair even more. After hearing Tai Ziyuan's uncontrollable coughing, she nodded with satisfaction and said, "Very good, Mr. Senator, you should cough harder." Tai Ziyuan calmly put the white handkerchief back into his jacket pocket and ignored her words. He trusted the most professional experts, but it did not mean that he was willing to start acting behind the scenes, not to mention that this was not acting. However, he was not angry. He sat calmly in the chair and waited for the makeup artist to make his pale cheeks paler, making him look weak. Under the protection of the Blackhawk Company's special guards and accompanied by more than 10 members of the senator's office staff, Tai Ziyuan walked along the street to the commercial square. Hearing the sharp sirens in the distance and the whimpering of the ambulance, he could not help but frown slightly. Both sides of the street were full of protesters lying in pools of blood. After the great shock, the eyes of the injured were extremely empty, and they did not respond to the first aid measures that the doctors performed. The silent demonstration crowd poured into the square. They had already taken off their black masks, and they angrily looked at the gray sky and the indifferent buildings. The cruel scene from before replayed in their minds, and they kept crying and cursing. In the previous 10 minutes, who knew how many of their companions had fallen under stones and fists? If it were not for the group of men in black with red ribbons rushing in with wooden sticks, today's people would have suffered even more tragic losses. The crowd angrily clenched their fists and shouted slogans, venting the anger and fear in their hearts until someone in the front row saw the pale and thin young counselor slowly walking to the podium. The silence turned into a wave of harmony. Like the young senator's footsteps, it slowly but firmly spread to the surroundings, turning the entire square into a sea of silence. The angry roars gradually faded away. Tens of thousands of people looked at the stage with expectant gazes. The countless details in this scene proved just how much influence Tai Ziyuan had after half a year of marching. Without much provocation, Tai Ziyuan spoke into the microphone with a slightly hoarse voice. He pointed at the fountain in the corner of the square and then pointed at the guardrail nearby. "Look here. Look over there. There's blood everywhere." There was a faint commotion in the crowd. Tai Ziyuan quietly watched the dense crowd below the stage. After a moment of silence, he said, "Humans are cruel animals. They are cruel to their enemies and cruel to themselves. This is because our biological markers are full of violent genes. Once released, we can even become intoxicated by them. Those vicious thugs from before used this blood to prove this point. Once released, violence is the most terrifying thing in the universe. I think Mr. President should know very well that once this demon jumps out of the wooden box, even he would find it difficult to put it back in. So, I really want to know what Mr. President would think if he saw the terrible scenes today with his own eyes. Would he have the courage to face the dripping blood of the people? Would he have the courage to listen to the voices of those whose bones were not crushed by the pressure of power and were broken by the criminals? Tai Ziyuan's expression was still cold. His indifferent and arrogant eyebrows slowly raised. Just like the voice at this moment, he suddenly leaned forward slightly. He approached the microphone and asked in a very soft voice, "I really want to ask Mr. President, is this still the fucking Federation?" After softly and calmly uttering his first profanity in public, Tai Ziyuan on the stage was silent for 10 seconds. He listened to the angry protests and insults of the people below the stage and confirmed that he had achieved the desired effect of the publicity department. When he was about to continue according to the words in his mind, he suddenly saw the gray sky in the distance. Layers of dark clouds suddenly dispersed, revealing a corner of the blue sky. Then he thought of a person. He couldn't help but wonder how that person would deal with this matter if it was him. Violence was the most terrible thing, but that person seemed to only be good at using violence. However, he could control it, so he only pulled out his knife on the strong and did not torture the weak. Tai Ziyuan silently thought of Su Lu, a smile that he didn't understand appeared in his eyes. After a short pause, he continued to speak into the microphone, "Maybe my decision will disappoint you, but I still adhere to the principle of anti-violence. We will continue to be silent and then move forward." As soon as his voice fell, and before he finished speaking, the dense crowd below the stage sounded disappointed and scolded. There were also faint cries. With the accompaniment of the sirens of the police cars and ambulances, it sounded particularly sad and frustrated. The people who had just experienced a violent conflict found it difficult to suppress the grievances in their hearts. The director of the public relations team, who was standing behind the stage, nervously glanced at the publicity department. He was shocked to find that the senator's speech had completely deviated from the proposal. The disappointed cries continued. The weakness shown by Tai Ziyuan, the marching leader, might directly cause the people's hearts to scatter. There were many people's movements in history, often because of some insignificant small details that led to the terrible consequences of collapse. At this critical moment, Tai Ziyuan's cheeks became paler, and his eyes became sharper. He coldly looked at the supporters below the stage, put his right hand on the table, and said in a deep voice, "They are thugs, but are we going to become thugs? We are against the government's disregard for the law, but are we going to step on it in advance? If the crime we accuse becomes the tool of our choice, then what right do we have to accuse others?" In the scene where the crowd was angry, any powerful speech, as long as it couldn't satisfy the psychological desire of the people, would not have much effect. His words were the same, and the scene did not change at all. However, at this moment, Tai Ziyuan covered his mouth with his left hand and coughed. His body was half bent on the table in pain, and his right hand was firmly pressed on the corner of the table. The sound of coughing was clearly transmitted to the street through the microphone, and it echoed incessantly. "Doctor! Doctor!" The subordinates of the senator's office rushed to the podium and anxiously called for the medical team. Tai Ziyuan waved his hand to stop his subordinates, slowly but firmly straightened his body, gently wiped the corner of his mouth with a handkerchief, quietly looked at the people below the stage, and continued with a hoarse voice, "Everyone, I don't want to be a more shameless leader than the president." Because of the violent coughing, his voice was more hoarse than before, as if his vocal cords had been polished by rough sandpaper. Every word that came out of his thin lips carried traces of blood, and when it entered everyone's ears, they could clearly feel his pain. The people on the street didn't hear the rest of his words clearly, but the people closest to the podium noticed that the white handkerchief in his left hand was tightly clenched, and they could faintly see traces of blood. People cried out in surprise, and then the news quickly spread. Giving up the foundation of the millennial family, dragging a disabled body, and leading everyone here from S2 to the capital, what was his purpose? The people looked at the thin young senator on the podium with sympathetic and respectful eyes, who was coughing up blood and seemed like he could collapse at any time. The originally noisy venue suddenly fell into silence again. I want to say to Mr. President, you may have lofty ideals or dreams, but you don't have the right to make the entire Federation pay the price for your ideals or dreams. Every citizen can only be responsible for their own actions, and pay the price voluntarily. I have already declared to you and the entire Federation, what can I do, and what are you willing to give up for the Federation? Today, this street was originally full of flowers that were welcomed by the people, but now there is only blood that is gradually turning black. At this moment, on behalf of everyone standing here, on behalf of those who are being rescued in the hospital, and on behalf of the 3 colleagues who have just left us, I reiterate our request to President Pabre, and to the government of the Federation that you lead. Tai Ziyuan looked at the ambulance that was leaving, and thought about the news that he had just received. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he was trying to hide the tears in his eyes. He clenched his fists and shouted at the camera, "We demand that the Management Committee of the Federation immediately establish a special investigation committee, and that the Supreme Court will appoint the first sequence of independent investigators. We demand that the President's residence hand over all data records to the committee. We demand that the Patriot Act be abolished immediately. We demand that the authority of the so-called Joint Investigation Department be terminated. We demand that President Pabre voluntarily give up his administrative privileges. In front of the law, in front of the word fairness, and in front of the glory of the Constitution, no one has any reason to enjoy special privileges, including the President and the Bureau of Proclamation. You have to answer the question raised by the Capital Special District Daily. Why was the route of the antique bell leaked? Why was the ghost fleet of the Empire able to hide in that star area for so long?" The steady and powerful voice echoed in the quiet street. Tai Ziyuan narrowed his eyes and looked at the distant sky and the nearby crowd. He silently remembered that a few years ago, there was once a judicial official of the Ministry of National Defense named Su Songzi, who had once accused Colonel Lake in a hearing, and that Shi Qinghai, who had once smilingly exercised the right of arrest in the Parliament Hill. At this time, a supervisor in the office suddenly rushed to the podium, walked behind him, and said a few words with a serious expression, which interrupted the young senator's memory. Tai Ziyuan suddenly frowned, like a plum tree that was about to burn. After a moment of silence, he approached the microphone and said to the crowd on the street, "We just received an infuriating news. Chief Editor Bob and reporter Wood of the Capital Special District Daily were arrested by the Federation government for treason after the emergency hearing in Parliament Hill. We don't know where they are now." Hearing this explosive news, tens of thousands of people suddenly became restless. People waved their bleeding fists and shouted silently and angrily. Tai Ziyuan opened his arms and motioned for the crowd to calm down. He frowned and said, "The indescribable grief and indignation at this time reminded me of something that Master Schiller once said. History has already proven that when it comes to things like reform, at the beginning, it is always the task of those with knowledge who are the first to realize it. But these people with knowledge must be able to research, think, be decisive, and have perseverance. He also knows how to use power, but he doesn't lie. He guides, but he doesn't cater. He doesn't look down on himself and think that he is everyone's performer. He also doesn't look down on others and think that they are his underlings. He is just a person among the masses. I think, this is the only way to do the work of the masses." A wind passed through the street, blowing a corner of his thin windbreaker and lifting the hair in front of his forehead. Tai Ziyuan slightly narrowed his eyes and said, "As a person among the masses, he can do the work of the masses. President Pabre has already used his actions to prove that he has long left the masses, so he can never become such a person. I don't know if I can become such a person, but I will try my best. Nothing can stop me, and you will be my most trusted partners. We will be on the road again. We will be silent all the way, walking through the mountains, through the cities, to the capital, to Charter Square, to the front of Parliament Hill, and to the balcony of the official residence. When that time comes, we will hold up the proud and noble head of the Federation and ask Pabre, 'Do you know that you are wrong?' If he still refuses to agree to our request, then Tai Ziyuan slowly raised his right arm on the stage and said, "We will not agree to it either." On the cold street, the tens of thousands of people below the stage resonated with the thin young member of parliament on the stage. They shouted 3 words like thunder, shattering the autumn wind and frost. "We will not agree." The lawn under the balcony of the official residence gradually turned dark yellow. Even if it was a special breed, under the invasion of the cold day after day, it had no choice but to gradually retreat. Dozens of special task force agents vigilantly watched the surroundings, and no one dared to stay outside the building. The scenery here was still peaceful. At least at this moment, the brave and hot-blooded protesters were still far away in Nankashao and did not have the opportunity to shout endlessly and vent their anger here. In the offices on the first floor of the official residence, the phones were ringing. As the center of the Federation's power, the official residence had to deal with too many burdensome affairs every day, especially now that the war with the Empire was still tense and ongoing, and there were many unstable factors within the Federation. Director Breen listened to the report from the Federation's news channel director on the other end of the phone, and his face gradually became gloomy. He did not give the other party more opportunity to explain and said coldly, "There is a simplest way to deal with everything. Don't you know what to do without material?" The reporters were attacked, and the freedom of the press was interfered with. "Do you want me to teach you how to do it? Learn from old Lou of Venus. He is holding a press conference at this time, accusing the silent army of condoning hooligans to beat reporters." After hanging up the phone, he took the teacup from his subordinate's hand and took a big sip, but he was almost scalded by the hot tea. His irritable mood suddenly broke through the critical value, and he directly scolded the female secretary who liked to wear a velvet skirt and show a pair of legs in front of him like a pig's head. It was only when the office television began to broadcast the emergency broadcast of the news channel that Director Breen's mood improved slightly. Looking at the beautiful female anchor on the screen, his eyebrows slowly relaxed. He thought of the intimate scene he had seen in a certain place in a certain year, month. He suddenly regretted his previous rude reaction and immediately reconnected the call to express his condolences. The female anchor, who had been in the position of news anchor for nearly 10 years but was still dignified and beautiful, had changed her usual calm demeanor. She frowned and used the most direct words to angrily accuse the incident that happened in the capital of South Kazhou today. In the emergency news, the Federation News Channel severely accused the protesters of brutally attacking the police and colluding with the notorious South Kazhou Mafia to kidnap frontline reporters with the intention of interfering with the freedom of the press. Before the news segment ended, the South Kazhou government also sent a letter of reprimand and strongly demanded that the leader of the Silent Army, Tai Ziyuan, must be responsible for the entire incident. Perhaps it was to reverse black and white, to confuse right and wrong, or perhaps it was because of their different standpoints and perspectives that led to completely opposite conclusions. No matter what really happened in the cold streets of South Kazhou, after the Federation's authoritative news channel's rich and colorful embellishment, it was afraid that the austere wind of autumn and winter would gradually change direction. The door of the Oval Office opened silently, and Director Breen walked in with a thick stack of paper documents. He looked at the president, who was standing by the window and silently looking at the lawn, and couldn't help but be slightly startled. He remembered that in the past 6 months, the president seemed to be staring at the lawn in a daze too many times. He put the paper documents in his hand on the table, and then looked at the back of the president, who was still broad but a little more desolate than before, and said, "Mr. President, this is the original draft of the article from the capital's Special Administrative Region Daily. In addition, the Secretariat has also finished sorting out the speech of Tai Ziyuan in South Kazhou." President Pabre put down the coffee cup in his hand, turned around, and walked over. A warm smile appeared on his dark face. He patted Breen on the shoulder and said, "You've worked hard these days. This is what we should do." Although it was a standard answer, Director Breen still completed it meticulously. As the president's closest subordinate, he didn't allow himself to make any mistakes in the details. President Pabre didn't look at the original draft of the newspaper, but used the fastest speed to scan through Tai Ziyuan's speech in South Kazhou half an hour ago. After a moment of silence, he said with slight emotion, 8 years ago, when I participated in the presidential election, he was only a college student under the age of 20, but he was already able to independently organize the planning headquarters. Now it seems that he has improved again. The content of the speech was very interesting. It wasn't deliberately sensational, but it had a very calm ability to incite. In addition, it seemed that the sudden but just right coughing up blood. I have to admit that in terms of political speeches, he is already a good opponent. The president didn't hide his admiration for Tai Ziyuan. He put the documents on the table with a slight smile, and turned to look at Breen. Different positions, so the methods used are naturally different. He is the challenger, so he can attack without any scruples. I have to defend my territory, but because of my identity, I can't debate with him. Speaking of which, I really miss the time when I was running for state senator, holding a microphone and debating with my opponent and the host. Director Breen smiled and said, most of the people of the Federation also miss your heroic appearance on the television debate stage. Speaking of which, many readers of your electronic micromagazine have asked you to pick up the pen again and write some political articles. The electronic micromagazine was an instant messaging platform that had only become popular in the Federation in recent years. Pabre, as the first president in the history of the Federation to come from the bottom, unexpectedly became the first user of the platform. President Pabre's hands were on the large desk behind him. His body was slightly raised, and he looked at the retro oil painting on the ceiling in silence for a moment. He seemed to be extremely relaxed. Help me record this. Yes. Schiller once said that people choose a leader out of fear of the human body, because humans are a kind of cruel animal. For others, they can turn into a beast at any time. Therefore, people want to suppress their violent impulses towards others, so everyone is willing to submit to the one and only dictator. Only this dictator can control violence. Because being afraid of such a person is much more worth it than being afraid of everyone. President Pabre said in a deep voice, the reason why there was a royal society in human history, and the reason why those big families above the law were able to survive for so many years in the Federation, is all because of this spontaneous fear of human beings. Therefore, when someone tries to seize illegal power, the first thing they do is to cause a wave of violence in society and increase the people's fear of the humans around them. Breen understood that the president's seemingly random words, coupled with the news channel's accusation, were undoubtedly a strong blow to the political foundation of the Silent March. After he finished recording, he looked at the encrypted information that he had just received in his electronic notebook. His eyebrows raised slightly, and he looked up and said with joy, Mr. President, we just received news that General Du Shaoqing will arrive at the Old Moon Base in 2 days. Du Shaoqing led the 4 frontline divisions to take a collective rest. This was a strategy that the Federation government had long formulated, so there was no mistake in the timing. President Pabre's face did not show any more expression, only calmly smiling. However, his heart was not as calm as he looked on the surface. For an entire 3 years, that famous Federation general led the troops and fought bravely on the front line, winning him the love and respect of countless Federation citizens. However, after all, it had been too long since they last met. Was that soldier who was silent, cold, and proud like an ice sculpture, but who was incomparably loyal to him, still the same as before? But still the same as before. Because of these 4 words, President Pabre thought of that intergalactic conversation. Du Shaoqing did not express any objections to the government's decision to transfer back, and this attitude made President Pabre feel very gratified. However, the other party strongly opposed to Lieutenant General Hu Yan taking over the position of the enemy's commander-in-chief. In Du Shaoqing's opinion, that Lieutenant General Hu, other than singing the praises of the president and helping Li Jiedu arrange trusted aides, had no other redeeming qualities. Even if this person was an expert in ground defense battles, he was still not a suitable candidate for the current Mo Hua planet. In fact, President Pabre understood why Du Xiaoqing was so vehemently opposed. It was because the current federal military knew very well that this Lieutenant General Hu Yan was Li Jiedu's absolutely hardcore trusted aide. If he was allowed to become the commander-in-chief, then Li Jiedu's power in the military would rapidly expand again. And 3 years ago, before Du Xiaoqing left for war, he had once warned in the president's official residence with a rare bluntness: his teacher at the first military academy, General Li Jiedu, could not be considered a true soldier at all. President Pabre's brows deeply furrowed, his thick black eyebrows seemingly unable to bear the burden of fatigue. He said, "Don't record what I'm going to say next. I just want to have a chat with you." Director Breen obeyed and closed the notebook. At the same time, he stopped the data collection work in the Oval Office. President Pabre walked to the window and picked up the cup of coffee that had long since turned cold. He drank a mouthful without tasting it and said, "Tai Ziyuan said that after a long period of secret operations, people will often forget their original purpose. In fact, I have always believed in this saying, and I am very worried that my companions from back then will forget their original purpose. However, due to the difficulty of this undertaking, we must unhesitatingly cast aside this kind of doubt. We must trust each other." Director Breen looked at his back. From General Du Xiaoqing's words at this moment, he was extremely sensitive to Mr. President's mood at this moment. Cold sweat instantly soaked his back, and he did not dare to respond. The 7 great families have planted so many spies in the various levels of government and bribed countless officials. Other than using secret investigations to purge them and using harsh political demands to force them to sever their relationship with those financial backers, what else can the government do? President Pabre turned around, a self-mocking smile hanging from the corners of his thick lips. Perhaps Tai Ziyuan never thought that the reason the government relies on secret operations to maintain its rule is precisely because his family and those old people are trying to shake the government's rule, and the government cannot use law and normal procedures to stop them. Including those protesters on the streets of Nank, even including most of the officials in the government, just how many people truly understand what I am doing? Could it be that I am not fighting for them? Outside the window, the cold wind was biting cold. White frost appeared between the tips of President Pabre's brows. He was extremely tired. 14 all-black advanced bulletproof cars formed an arrogant motorcade. They passed through Highway 2 and slowly drove into the capital special district where the cold wind wreaked havoc. Under the strict request of the people in the cars, the black motorcade did not exceed the speed limit, nor did they randomly change lanes. The reason why people felt that they were arrogant was because these advanced bulletproof cars, which seemed like they should only be used by important government figures, actually all had civilian license plates of Nank. Under the curious and shocked gazes of the people on the streets, under the vigilant monitoring of the Federation Investigation Bureau, and under the supervision of several police cars, the black motorcade silently passed through a small part of the city and drove into the extremely beautiful Linyuan. In the past, the Linyuan was packed with people, but today, it seemed even more lonely. The antique cast iron doors were completely open, and the attendants stood on both sides, welcoming the return of the owner. Cold raindrops floated in the sky. As soon as the heavy car door opened, a wide black umbrella opened, blocking the raindrops outside. Then, the raindrops followed the person under the umbrella as they walked forward. Lin Banshan looked at the thin newspaper in his hand in the dark sky and walked forward by himself. He absolutely did not have to worry about the black umbrella above his head not being able to block the rain. Relatively speaking, the words of Chief Editor Bob in the newspaper attracted his attention more than the prying eyes outside the garden. Walking into the Linyuan Hall, his subordinates helped him take off his coat that was stained with raindrops. Lin Banshan walked inside and stopped by a mahogany desk in a flowing corridor. He did not look at the official opposite him and sat down expressionlessly. He poured himself a cup of rice wine and slowly took a sip. After all, we are considered acquaintances. I have entrusted you with my business in Bermuda for many years. Are you not even willing to say hello now? The official had white hair on his temples and deep wrinkles on his forehead. He did not look young, but he was the youngest national security advisor in the history of the Federation. In the face of the top 5 big shots in the Federation government, Lin Banshan's expression did not show any signs of loosening. He put down the wine glass and began to try to smooth out the wrinkled newspaper on the mahogany desk. It seemed that he was preparing to continue reading. The National Security Advisor frowned slightly, suppressed the unhappiness in his heart, and said, "Mr. Banshan, in this Federation, there are definitely no more than 3 people who can make me wait for so long. I'm not saying that I want you to meet me outside the Linyuan, but for the sake of this sincerity, shouldn't you show more respect?" Hearing this sentence, Lin Banshan raised his eyebrows slightly, and a trace of ridicule appeared in his deep eyes like craggy rocks. He said, "Meet you outside the Linyuan? In my life, I have only met one person outside the Linyuan. That person was called Li Pifu. Are you sure you have the qualifications?" The wrinkles on the National Security Advisor's forehead deepened. The anger caused by the other party's arrogance gradually faded after hearing the name of the military god. After a moment of silence, he looked at Lin Banshan and said very seriously, "Isn't Bermuda very good? Why do you have to come back at this time? This will make a lot of people nervous." "This is the Federation. This is my hometown. Do I need your permission to come back?" Lin Banshan looked at him coldly and said, "Or does the government want to vet us, the returnees from Bermuda? If Cui Zhedong dares to say a word, I will admit to this." Hearing Cui Zhedong's name, the National Security Advisor subconsciously picked up the weak tea in front of him, but did not drink it. The upper echelons of the government knew very well that Lin Banshan and the Bureau of Proclamation, especially the former director, had a very complicated relationship. This person was even one of the candidates for the director of the Bureau of Proclamation. Since the current director of the Bureau of Proclamation, Cui Zhedong, did not dare to act rashly, then the government's path was naturally closed off. After thinking for a moment, the National Security Advisor looked at him and said calmly, "The government knows very well why you came back, but what we don't understand is that you have already betrayed your family. Why do you seem to care so much now? And you should know very well why the government has not done anything to the Lin family. It seems that you really don't understand people like us." Lin Banshan leaned back slightly, looked down at the other party indifferently, and said, "Probably only the Crown Prince can understand. We really do hate those lifeless manners, and those old men who still like to play the role of the creator behind the curtain even though they have half a foot in the grave." His voice suddenly hardened as he stared into the security consultant's eyes and said coldly, "But you have to understand one thing. This is our home. Even if we want to destroy it, we can only destroy it with our own hands. It will never be your turn to do so." The National Security Advisor looked at him like he was crazy. Just as he was about to say something, Lin Banshan waved his hand and forced him to swallow all his words. Lin Banshan said mockingly, "People like President Pabre, no matter what kind of filthy things they do, will always say sorrowfully that no one understands my good intentions. I am doing this for your good. Why can't you understand? But the problem is, who the fuck wants you to be good to me?" A fierce man can suddenly change his face into a resentful woman. He is used to being a mother. This kind of thing is really ridiculous. However, I have a mother, so do the people on the streets of Nankazhou. Everyone in the Federation has a mother. We don't want to have another mother with a face full of black shoe polish. I don't like this president. This is the main reason why I came back. People who live far away from official residences pay attention to a natural and unrestrained aura. Hypocrites like this must be destroyed as soon as I see one." Lin Banshan smiled freely and said, "Otherwise, I can't be happy." When the National Security Advisor heard this, he was silent for a long time. Then he smiled with a complicated expression and said, "I understand what you mean, but in the end, I still hope you can understand that although you are the local tyrant of Bermuda and have the support of some desperate hooligans at the bottom of society, this is the Federation. It is very stupid to fight against the government with these things. After Lin Banshan expressed his attitude, he directly picked up the newspaper and began to read the article by Chief Editor Bob for the fourth time. He no longer paid attention to this person, nor did he have the intention to get up and send him off. After this big government figure left, Lin Yuan began to serve his master. Just as the cups and plates were gently passed, on a certain planet in Bermuda, the property that belonged to the National Security Advisor instantly disappeared. Outside the window, the white mountains were still as before, and the wind and rain were bleak. At this moment, on the wide and clear floor-to-ceiling glass window, a huge glass flower suddenly appeared. Like a spider web, it shattered in an instant and then spread. Then the dull sound of a sniper rifle bullet hitting the window rang out in spirals. Lin Banshan looked back at the miserable glass flower on the floor-to-ceiling window and shook his head expressionlessly. Then he continued to read the newspaper calmly. The hand holding the newspaper did not tremble at all. After a slight panic, the waiters around them immediately recovered and began to serve the dishes like flowing water. Their minds were firm, just like the seemingly ordinary but indestructible floor-to-ceiling windows around Lin Yuan. Using a bullet to end someone's life was not a funny joke. It should be known that this man with mountain-like shoulders was not as simple as an underworld tycoon who spanned across 2 major galaxies. He was Lin Banshan. Chapter 886. The gunshot rang out, and then there was no follow-up. The Lin Yuan Hall was as quiet as usual. The waiter walked back and forth between the water corridors with light footsteps carrying dishes. Lin Banshan put down the newspaper and began to eat and drink in silence until he heard the footsteps behind him. He picked up the white napkin and slowly wiped the corner of his mouth, then looked back. After hearing what the other party said, he couldn't help but frown slightly. He seemed to feel that this matter was a greater threat to the Federation government, more troublesome than a bullet that made a glass flower on the window. Young master is making a fuss about coming back. That lady can't keep an eye on him at all. She just called. The pale middle-aged man was wearing a very stern black suit. As Lin Banshan's closest companion, he was qualified to handle all communication requests from Bermuda. Lin Banshan's face was a little ugly, and he said with disgust, "Tell Feirong, if he makes a fuss again, throw him into the Purple Star Sea to feed the sharks. Just say that I said this." The man in black nodded and left the hall. Regarding Lin Banshan's family matters, neither he nor Zhang Xiaohua had the qualifications nor the courage to say anything. Relatively speaking, he was more interested in the semi-conscious killer in the basement. The dark basement and the quiet and noble dining garden on the ground seemed out of place. The pale cheeks of the middle-aged man in black looked even more gloomy in this lighting environment. He smiled at the killer who had just been woken up and said with a smile, "I'm Han Chu. My name is Han Chu. I believe you should have heard of my name before you carried out the mission. Since you are so stupid or arrogant that you didn't commit suicide after shooting at the forest garden, you better use the most concise way to introduce yourself." The corner of the assassin's mouth was bleeding. A few of his teeth must have been knocked out. His clothes were messy and bloody from the previous torture, but his expression was very calm and steady. He did not show any fear. However, when he heard the name Han Chu, he looked up at the other party and saw the pale face in the dim light. He remembered the terrible records in the information, and his pupils suddenly shrank. For the first time, he felt regret. Although he was a professionally trained elite with strong nerves, he didn't want to fall into the hands of this person. Compared to this person's means, the previous so-called torture was just a joke. I said, hearing the other party's words. Han Chu smiled and leaned against the wall. He took out a cheap wooden comb from his collar and began to comb his white hair carefully. He seemed to be indifferent, but he had captured these words deeply in his mind and turned them into part of his database. Could it be that the second military region only produces idiots like you? He shook his head and sneered at the man on the ground. If it was the legendary Small Eyes Special Forces, this matter would probably be more challenging. I say, can you be more professional? Since you want to kill someone, shouldn't you have studied the information more thoroughly in advance? Lin Yuan's glass is all specially made with fruit shells. Don't you know this? Han Chu carefully put the wooden comb with some hair oil back into his pocket, squatted down and gently patted the other party's blood-stained face, and said, if all the soldiers in the military are elites like you, how are we going to fight the empire? We are not an ordinary gang. We are the most professional gang. I hate unprofessional people like you the most in my life. You have no skill at all. The subordinate behind him stopped filming and asked in a low voice, Mr. Han, what should we do next? Although the front line needs cannon fodder, I don't think soldiers with such qualities should go to the Federation to make a fool of themselves. It's not a big deal to waste them. Han Chu stood up and crossed his hands, which were as white as a woman's. He watched his subordinates drag the military killer away like a dead dog. After a moment of silence, he looked at his subordinates who had been silently waiting for orders and said in a delicate tone, Boss said that since Mr. President started to use unscrupulous means, it is very good news for us. Because in the Federation, there is certainly no one better than us. Now that the government has fired the first shot, it's time for us to return the favor. Hong Yuming had been the director of the Federation's news channel for almost 3 years. During these years, he humbly and actively cooperated with the relevant departments. With the help of the complicated new laws and regulations, he investigated all the officials in the news channel and used all kinds of methods to purge and oppress them. With the staff with Macho's background being forced to leave, the news channel, the biggest and most authoritative media organization in the Federation, gradually broke away from the influence of the Tai family and was controlled by the Federation government. Gradually, it became the most loyal mouthpiece of the president's official residence. He, who was over 50 years old, made a great contribution to the government. Naturally, he was rewarded handsomely. The luxurious villa in the suburbs of the capital, as well as the wild horse taming field in the forest far away that the HTD Bureau had never asked about, were a few of the important parts. Every time he thought of the wild horses that drank water by the stream and galloped on the grassland, but in the end, could only become his most tame mount, excitement welled up in Hong Yoming's heart. This made him more and more certain that his choice in politics was very wise. Because of the bloody incident at the South Kazhou rally, Hong Yuming had been monitoring the operations of the various departments in the news channel building. In the end, after the filtering of the news channel and the relevant media, the Federation government pointed the spearhead of the bloody incident at the organizer of the Silent March, the young senator. Then he received the kind words of praise from Director Brin in the office of the president's official residence. Only then did he truly relax and return to the villa in the suburbs to have a good rest. Mr. Hong Yuming had to reward himself before going to bed. He hugged a beautiful woman sent by a certain advertiser and spent the night flirting with her. Then, he read 2 pages of Master Schiller's early mafia novels and fell asleep with the fantasy of riding a wild horse with a naked beauty tomorrow. His dream was filled with a wonderful red color. In the early morning, he woke up rubbing his eyes and squinted at the faint morning light coming through the floor-to-ceiling curtains. He felt that life was like this, and it was difficult to ask for more. Rubbing his sparse hair, he smiled slightly and gently hugged his left arm. He wanted to hug the soft and boneless woman and kiss her intimately, but he found that the touch on his arm was a little strange. It was sticky, wet, and a little hard. Hong Yuming frowned and lifted the soft silk quilt. His pupils suddenly shrank, and he jumped up from the bed in horror. Looking at the thing under the quilt, he let out a shrill scream. The bed was stained with a large blood stain. In the middle of the blood stain, there was no soft and boneless beauty, only a huge black head of a wild horse. The wild horse's head was lying alone in the pool of blood. Its big and beautiful eyes were not closed. Leaning on the soft pillow, it calmly looked at him. Hong Yoming's face was pale. He angrily shouted away the people who heard the scream and came to ask questions. Covering his mouth tightly, he stared at the huge wild horse's head on the bed and recognized that it was his favorite horse. Then his legs began to tremble violently. At this moment, he didn't have the energy to think about where the woman lying beside him had gone. His mind had been completely destroyed by fear. Thinking of the most famous scene in Master Schiller's early mafia novels, he slowly squatted down and then began to see in the early winter of the 75th year of the constitutional calendar, on the same cold day and almost at the same time, the Federation News Channel, from the highest level to the most ordinary staff in the computer room, experienced the darkest period of their lives. The most beloved wife of a senior manager was kidnapped, and the ordinary staff received an ordinary letter with a bullet in it. Because the mysterious cloud-like force appeared and disappeared mysteriously, and did not make any specific demands, no one dared to call the police. Winsky sounded like a man's name, but in fact, this name represented a very famous woman in the Federation. This woman had been the anchor of the Federation News Channel for almost 10 years. Her dignified, graceful, and beautiful face would appear on the TV screen of every family at a fixed time every day. When there was a big event, she would unreasonably occupy all the time. For example, the attack on the Linhai Gymnasium, the secret visit of Mr. Pabre when he was still a member of the Federation, the explosion of Jian Shui'er's concert, the successful election of Pabre as the president of the Federation, the revenge of Su Lu from morning to night, and then the return of Su Lu, and then the defection of Su Lu, and so on. In terms of fame alone, Ms. Winsky was definitely not inferior to any celebrity in the Federation. She was even comparable to Jian Shui'er, who was famous throughout half the universe. She was dignified and intelligent, and her mind was clear. Although she was compassionate, she had self-control. No one in the Federation felt that they were tired of her and were willing to continue watching her like this. In a dark cafe in the south of the capital, Han Chu looked at the female anchor across the table with a smile. He did not even blink as he watched her attentively. He slowly undid the top 2 buttons of his black formal suit. The female anchor, Winsky, had never been stared at so rudely before, not even by a man. Moreover, he had stared at her for 5 or 6 minutes. However, she did not get angry. She lowered her eyes slightly and looked at the coffee cup beside her hand. She said as calmly as possible, "I don't know what you meant by what you said on the phone, but I have to remind you that my time is very precious." Han Chu praised, "After all, you are the best female anchor in the Federation. At a time like this, you can still hide your trembling voice under your calmness. It is truly admirable. However, you need to understand that our time is very precious. I spent a lot of effort to lure away those agents from the Special Task Force." Winsky raised her head and looked at him with a frown. A trace of nervousness appeared on her beautiful face, but it was immediately turned into a kind of fear by the gloomy aura of this middle-aged man in black. She lowered her voice and said, "I don't know what you want, but important people like you should know very well that I have no influence on the news channel at all, even though I am sitting on the anchor platform. At a time like this, not only is it meaningless to continue this kind of test, but it is also very stupid and unprofessional. It will easily anger me." Han Chu slowly withdrew his smile and looked coldly at the female anchor's face. He took out an envelope from his clothes and gently placed it on the table. He pushed it in front of her and continued, "Since we have found you, it naturally means that we know very well who is really controlling the broadcast content of the Federation News Channel." Winsky picked up the envelope with trembling fingers and took out the photos inside. She silently looked at the back door of the restaurant in the photos. She looked at the broad hand on her shoulder and looked at the broad back. She couldn't help but cover her mouth with her hand, and tears appeared in her eyes due to fear. Although there are no bed photos, there are still many frontal photos that can explain the situation or make people speculate. Han Chu expressionlessly stirred the silver spoon in his coffee cup. He lowered his head and said, "If the official residence receives these photos, with your intelligence level, you should know very well what you will face." Winsky raised her head and stared at him. She said sadly, "I won't allow you to slander him. He is not the kind of person you're talking about. What kind of person he is has nothing to do with me. Whether it is love or adultery between the two of you has nothing to do with me. However, I can make a concession to the naivety of women like you." Han Chu slowly raised his head and looked coldly into her eyes. He said, "If you don't want too much trouble in your life, I suggest that you take sick leave tomorrow and not go to work. Of course, if you want to stay away from all this trouble, I can arrange for you to go to Bermuda." After a moment, he continued, "You know what we are capable of. Even the Federation president can't hurt you there." The next day was Wednesday. It was the broadcast time of the highest-rated show on the Federation News Channel, Today's Federation. After dinner, the people continued to discuss the recent frontline situation and the demonstration on the sofa. Then, almost instinctively, they turned the TV to this channel. Last week's Today's Federation discussed the bloody incident that had just happened in South Kazhou. In the final preview of the show, the discussion would continue in this episode. However, what surprised the audience was that today's anchor was not the gentle and amiable Winsky, but a somewhat unfamiliar male face. This young broadcaster, who had just graduated from the Department of Media at the Capital University, nervously explained the reason why the female anchor, Winsky, could not host because she had caught a cold. Then, with a stuttering voice, he invited the guest to continue the topic discussed last week: who should be responsible for the violent incident. Some of the impatient male audience members who only wanted to see a mature female anchor were about to change the channel. Before the old guest on the screen could say a word, the news channel directly cut to the scene of the bloody incident in South Kazhou. From the footage taken from upstairs, it could be clearly seen that the pro-government demonstrators holding banners were cursing at the silent marching team on the other side of the fence. Then, like a tide, they rushed over, using stones and fists to launch a ferocious attack on the people wearing masks. In countless apartments, in countless rooms, some of the audience members put down their bowls in shock. Some of the audience members opened their mouths in shock. Some of the audience members were so shocked by the bloody scene that they did not dare to watch. Chapter 887. After the bloody incident in South Kazhou, under the strong accusations of the government and the continuous attacks of countless news media, the mainstream of the Federation society believed that Tai Ziyuan and the silent protesters were responsible for the incident. Although there were some angry denunciations on the internet, it did not attract much attention and no one believed them. The people of the Federation did not know what really happened that day until they saw the bloody scene on the news channel. They saw the stones flying in the sky, smashing the heads of the women and the elderly, while the military police looked on indifferently from a distance. The angle of the video was very comprehensive and the time period was very long. Some of the material came from the news channel and the Golden Star documentary film studio, while some was provided by the data department of Tai Ziyuan's office. It was quite rich. Although the editing technique was a bit amateur, the choppy switching of the scenes brought a great psychological impact to the audience. The riot police of South Kazhou were lining up to evacuate. The violence in the middle of the street was escalating. In the distance, a middle-aged official wearing a windbreaker was talking on the phone. There was a strange smile on his face. These were scenes that the people of the Federation had never seen before. Just like that, they jumped out of the TV screen in a raw manner. In a situation where no one was mentally prepared, they were ruthlessly smashed into their brains. The camera lens suddenly zoomed in from upstairs to the ground, aiming at a middle-aged man who was cold-bloodedly waving an iron rod in the crowd. Even the most ordinary people could smell the scent of a powerful organization from this man, because he appeared to be too calm. The scene changed again, aiming at an alley behind the street. The middle-aged man who was cold-bloodedly beating the protesters was paralyzed on the wall with blood all over his head. He looked at the approaching camera in horror, but he could not stop the hand beside the camera from pulling hard, pulling out a bunch of surveillance equipment from under his clothes, as well as a police officer's ID. After the Today's Federation broadcast the video for 17 minutes, the government of the Federation reacted and used remote authority to directly stop the broadcast. The person who made the video, Han Chu with a gloomy and pale face, did not care about this. The following scenes of the South Kuzhou Mafia brothers rushing into the alley would not be broadcasted, but the previous scenes of blood flying everywhere, even if the TV screen turned black, would still stay on the retina of the Federation people for a long time, which was enough to explain too much of the truth. Of course, a more complete video had been uploaded to the Federation's civilian network at the same time the news channel was broadcasted, and entered countless computers in the shortest time possible. As the oldest, most authoritative news channel in the Federation, as well as the one with the widest audience, it had shockingly changed its conservative and even somewhat dull style in recent years. With unimaginable courage, it had suddenly broadcasted such a video that exposed the dark secrets behind the bloody incident in South Kuzhou. This itself was a topic that was worth exploring. However, in the fierce response caused by the video, this topic had long been forgotten. Countless people felt cheated and fooled, and angrily called to complain. As time passed, the far-reaching impact of the broadcast gradually revealed its true valiance. The people of various states, who had been silently watching the march with mixed feelings, began to take to the streets in twos and threes. There were more and more demonstrations of various sizes, and the people angrily demanded an explanation from the government. For days after the broadcast of the video, after 14 hours of fierce debate, the Parliament Hill passed a resolution at 2:30 a.m. requesting the government to provide a detailed explanation of the bloodshed incident in South Kuzhou. At the same time, a temporary investigation committee was set up, and Senator Tai Ziyuan and the relevant officials of South Kuzhou were summoned to the Parliament Hill for questioning. The Press Association issued an announcement through major media, requesting the government to immediately release Chief Editor Bob and Senior Reporter Wood of the Capital Special District Daily. They also solemnly apologized for the incident, and promised that such a situation would never happen again. Winter had already arrived in the Northern Hemisphere, and the Capital Special District finally had its first real snow. In the cold, large snowflakes, many people were keenly aware that the cold wind that passed through the leaden clouds seemed to be gradually changing direction. At this time, the Federation government made their response. In the Oval Office, President Pabre gave a televised speech to the entire Federation. In the televised speech, President Pabre did not deliberately hide the anger on his dark face, nor the deep fatigue between his eyebrows. He used a low and deep voice and a simple and sincere attitude to solemnly apologize to all the people of the Federation on behalf of the Federation government. Following that, he strongly praised the courage of the news channel to reveal the truth, and announced that the bloodshed incident in South Kuzhou would be thoroughly investigated and severely punished. He would not allow such an ugly incident to happen again in the beautiful land of the Federation. The Federation government's investigation was very fast. The Temporary Investigation Committee on the Parliament Hill had not even come up with the establishment charter, and Senator Tai Ziyuan had not yet boarded the plane back to the capital. The Joint Investigation Department of the government, consisting of the Bureau of Proclamation, the Ministry of National Defense, and the Federation Bureau of Investigation, flew to the capital of South Kuzhou with a murderous aura. That night, they arrested the director of the state police. The next morning, after reading a resignation statement, the governor of South Kuzhou committed suicide in his luxurious office. The Federation government's investigation was very fast and tough. It was not only limited to the bloodshed incident in South Kuzhou. Those sharp knives had quietly woven into a net, enveloping those people in the underworld of South Kuzhou. At the same time when the governor of South Kuzhou committed suicide, the Joint Investigation Department with high authority directly took over all the police departments in South Kuzhou and all the foreign spies of the Federation Bureau of Investigation. With a thunderous momentum, they swept through more than 40 streets in 13 cities in the state, silently and sternly destroying all the underworld halls in South Kazhou. For this operation, the Federation government dispatched a total of more than 20,000 military and police spies, and more than 4,300 underworld members were arrested on the spot. 7 of the underworld's core members were shot dead on the spot because they resisted arrest. All the detention centers and prisons in South Kazhou were instantly filled with underworld members. However, these underworld members still had indifferent expressions on their faces. The special forces directly under the Joint Investigation Department, under the cover of the night before dawn, raided the underworld headquarters in South Kazhou 3 hours in advance. This special forces started 3 years ago in the pursuit of Su Lu and had become more powerful over the years. All the members were from the Philadelphia Body Cultivation Gym. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and extremely powerful. And this time, they only had one target, Zhang Xiaohua. However, they did not find Zhang Xiaohua's figure at all. In the back of a container truck transporting seafood from South Kazhou to the capital special district, under a lot of frozen fish, a burly underworld leader wearing an oxygen mask sat silently with his legs crossed. He was wearing very thick clothes, and the tattoo of a big flower on the back of his neck looked particularly cold and ferocious because of the cold. On his right hand was an extremely big and fat fish with a gun hidden in its belly. The investigation must continue in depth. I sincerely hope that Parliament Hill can conduct a comprehensive re-examination of this matter. I believe that no one wants the truth of the bloodshed incident in South Kazhou to be annihilated with the suicide of that coward. President Pabre, who was tired but still had a determined gaze, stared at the camera of the news channel, facing all the Federation citizens on the other side of the camera, and facing the enemies hidden in the dark. He calmly said in a low voice, whether the voters believe it or not, whether this statement is naive or childish, I am willing to swear on my father's character again. Before the bloodshed incident in South Kazhou, I and the staff directly under the president's residence had never heard of the situation, and had nothing to do with this incident. This is the promise of the Federation President Pabre, whom you elected. Lin Banshan quietly looked at the TV screen and shook his head. He was too lazy to make any negative comments about the Federation president who swore on his father's character on the TV. He stood up, took the windbreaker from his secretary, and put it on his shoulders. He silently walked out of the Linyuan, and then saw the Federation Investigation Bureau officers who had come to arrest him at the entrance of the Linyuan. A cold anti-riot armored vehicle and more than a dozen secret agents in black suits. Lin Banshan frowned slightly. He didn't know if he should think that the government valued him, or that they were underestimating his strength. Government employees are paid, not soldiers, so I suggest that you don't risk your lives. After a moment of silence, Lin Banshan made a rare suggestion, as if he was giving the most authoritative commentary to his suggestion or threat. A gunshot rang out in the forest in the distance of the Linyuan. The gunshot was gentle and even delicate, but the armor of the anti-riot vehicle blocking the entrance of the Linyuan was torn apart by the bullet like a piece of paper, and a cloud of white smoke burst out. The agents of the Federation government were pale. They couldn't imagine this scene at all. Although Lin Banshan had made a name for himself in the Federation more than a decade ago, no one believed that this underworld emperor dared to go to war with the Federation government, and that he actually had such a terrifying long-range weapon in his hands. With a bang, the black umbrella opened. Lin Banshan slowly walked out of the Linyuan under the protection of more than 40 armed bodyguards. He didn't even look at the government officials. After he got into the car, he made a call. I'm not Sulu. I'm not interested in going to war with the Federation government, but they want to invite me back to the bureau for tea without any reason. Moreover, it's a low-level place like the Federation Investigation Bureau. I feel humiliated. If it was your bureau, maybe I'd be interested. Old Chui, I'm not familiar with Zhong Laohu, so I don't care how Tai Ziyuan and Madman Li will deal with you in the future, but between me and the president, you have to remain neutral. I'll be going back to the countryside to stay for a few days. If the government wants to find me, you know what to do. The director of the Bureau of Proclamation on the other end of the phone said something, but Lin Banshan patiently waited for him to finish. He said in an unquestionable tone, "If you want to find me, then I'll go to the Bureau of Proclamation to find you." Chapter 888. In this world, there might be people who dared to threaten the President of the Federation, but how many dared to threaten the Director of the Bureau of Proclamation, Cui Jiadong? That square building represented the glory of the Charter. It was as mysterious and boundless as the sea of stars, but it was not within the scope of Lin Banshan's consideration. Not many people knew that he had been working for the Bureau of Proclamation ever since he betrayed his family when he was young. He was even the most promising successor of old Director Tai, but he did not like that strange building. Just like how not many people knew that the Federation only had 2 ACWs. One was in the hands of Shi Qinghai, who had displayed countless brilliance. He had blasted the Golden Foundation building in the Red Leaves and killed Vice President Byron under the stone steps of the Parliament Hill. Now that big gun was in the hands of the Federation's former enemy commander-in-chief, Du Shaoqing, while the other ACW had always been in the hands of Lin Banshan. It had been silent for many years until now. Outside the window, the snowflakes slowly drifted back, making the White Mountain even more blurred and difficult to see. Lin Banshan calmly looked at the scenery outside the window and thought of the battle outside the Linyuan Gate. He could not help but shrug his shoulders in self-mockery. The lady behind Macho's back mountain had privately evaluated him. If he was born in a chaotic world, he could be an ambitious and ruthless person. Now that the Federation was in chaos, the official residence and the Parliament Hill, these solemn and sacred places, had begun to use the words, by hook or by crook. This was the beginning of a chaotic world. The ambitious and ruthless Lin Banshan had been lurking in the wilderness for many years in the dark foreign land. He seemed to be extremely far away from the peak of power in this world. However, with a casual wave of his hand, the cold wind blew and the snow clouds moved chaotically. Just like at this moment, his shoulders were as steep as a mountain, giving the feeling that the cliff was about to collapse. Arrogant people had their own reasons and qualifications to be arrogant. Those who could be called ambitious and ruthless naturally had the bloody facts of the past as irrefutable evidence. For example, Du Shaoqing, who had already arrived at the Old Moon base, could be called a famous general of the Federation because his general uniform had too many victorious halos. Naturally, his undefeated reputation would not be shaken. The Empire's army attempted to take advantage of his absence from the front lines to launch a vicious counterattack, hoping to expand the controllable battlefield on the surface as much as possible. However, no one would have thought that after this person left the Ink Flower planet, he would leave a gift for the Empire in the Straits. On a warship countless light years away, a precise strategic trap was set in the middle of the scorched earth. This gift was like a burst of fireworks, exceptionally tragic. Due to the completely unequal electronic signal suppression and signal disguise, as well as the fierce attacks launched by the 4 Federation mechanics in the southwest war zone toward the heavy oil ink mine, the Dynasty headquarters did not notice the recent troop movements of the Federation at all. On the other hand, the hundreds of miniature data relay stations that took 127 days to slowly move here from the atmosphere of the planet waited silently for another 27 days under the cold background of the universe. When the tremors came from the depths of the Straits Valley, they were suddenly activated, forming a temporary charter network. Thus, when the 3 reorganized mecha clans of the Empire used the cover of the night to pass through the straits at high speed, attempting to attack the most important equipment base of the Federation forces, they suddenly found themselves surrounded by 5 Federation mecha divisions and countless long-range missile troops. Compared to the million-strong army on the bloody battlefield of planet Mo Hua, the 3 mecha brigades of the Empire and the 7 mecha operators of the Federation did not seem particularly shocking. However, These 3 mecha brigades of the Empire were all equipped with the latest Wolf Fang mecha, while the 5 mecha operators of the Federation were all equipped with the latest MX mecha. They were definitely the strongest and most important force on the surface of the planet. There was a great disparity in the efficiency of the battlefield command network. The Federal troops had seized the advantage of the geographical advantage, and they also had powerful long-range firepower support. Because of these 3 simple reasons, both sides were fully prepared. Once the flames of war broke out in the Straits meeting theater of operations, victory and defeat would be decided immediately. In less than 3 days, the reorganized Wolf Fang mecha clan of the Agarwood Empire was completely wiped out. If the other 2 mecha clans were not the bravest and most skilled royal troops, perhaps this battle would have ended long ago. But even so, with their path of retreat cut off and deliberately lured by the Federation staff to the gravel area on the west side of the Straits, the Empire forces that could not fully utilize the agility of the Wolf Fang mecha still gradually fell into despair during the battle. This was especially so when the mecha named Beheading led a torrent of steel and charged over with incomparable brutality. The Empire headquarters at the rear was in chaos. The staff was filled with hoarse shouts as they tried their best to bring the remaining mecha clans back. Densely packed drones took off in high density, attempting to destroy the temporary charter network outside the atmosphere of the Straits battle zone. After calming down a little, everyone in the Empire headquarters was pondering a question. Why did the 4 Federation divisions in the southwest side of the graphite mine area make the feints so realistic? Why did they not care about the heavy casualties and continue to attack with such high intensity? Why did the headquarters completely misjudge the true intentions of the Federation forces? Yes, the battle in the graphite mine area was even more intense than the Straits battle zone. During those 17 days of silent waiting, the entire Mo Hua planet was peaceful. Only this area was filled with smoke and broken limbs. Without any more support, the 4 Federation divisions launched a tide-like attack on the tightest area of the Empire's defense line as if they did not care about their own lives. They soldered the enemy's reserve brigade firmly in the southwest direction, not daring to move in the slightest. If this was a feint, then these soldiers of the Federation divisions were using their own lives to cover for their brothers in the Straits area. They were using suicidal attacks to confuse the enemy. These were all the arrangements made by Du Shaoqing before he left Mo Hua planet. In reality, in the military order, he did not mention anything about feints at all. He simply requested that the troops must take down the graphite mine in the southwest direction at all costs. The Federation forces in the southwest didn't even know that this was a feint, so how would the Empire know? This was perhaps a crafty path that did not belong to the realm of fair and square. However, in order to maintain the balance of power after leaving the front lines and to be able to take a bite of the Empire's most delicious piece of meat in one go, Du Shaoqing made up his mind without hesitation. After the battle, when he saw the forest-like tombstones of the southwest troops, perhaps he would take off his hat to mourn, but his expression would definitely be as cold as before, like an emotionless ice sculpture, and he would not regret it. Because this was war, because the 2 divisions with the heaviest casualties were both from the 3rd Military Region. The 3rd Division and the 11th Division were Du Shaoqing's closest troops other than the Iron 7th Division. It was at such a moment that the black spaceship, which looked like a pile of metal garbage, arrived at the outskirts of Mo Hua planet. It quietly stopped behind an asteroid belt, avoiding the detection of the military satellites of both the Empire and the Federation. Philip used 7 seconds to successfully infiltrate, or rather, he returned to the Federation, this piece of the glory of the charter that had been cut off. It was very obvious that the Federation's Bureau of Proclamation had made a lot of corresponding preparations in the past 3 years. He could not obtain the highest level of authority, nor could he obtain comprehensive information, but it was already enough for him to clearly see the story before and after the battle at the Straits. Su Le silently looked at the information on the screen, and then he turned his head to look out the window. Looking at the flames that lit up from time to time in that half of Mo Hua planet's night sky, he could not help but slightly narrow his eyes, once again confirming that he would never become a truly powerful soldier like Du Shaoqing in this lifetime. In the blink of an eye, tens of thousands of subordinates fell one after another for the sake of a cold strategic goal. He could not face it calmly. They were both determined, but there was a difference between inside and outside. Only a truly ambitious and ruthless character could be like this. Every qualified battlefield commander was an ambitious and ruthless character. Chapter 889. Planet Mo Hua Planet, Mart City, where the Empire headquarters was located. All the civilians within a 70 kilometers radius had been chased away to the flatlands further back. The buildings around the streets still had the burnt marks left behind by the Federation's airstrikes. The buildings that were rich in ultra-hard graphite fibers were strong and stubborn, and refused to fall. The bullet holes in the walls formed many walkways, and the Empire soldiers in dark military uniforms walked through them with serious expressions. They did not find the joy of playing hide-and-seek in their childhood. On the other end of the road full of bullet holes, under the protection or surveillance of a few Empire scouts, a young man wearing a hooded tracksuit walked over silently. The tracksuit was very ordinary, and it was covered with the unique red soil of the suburbs. However, it attracted countless curious gazes from the soldiers who were resting or walking between the broken walls. It should be known that in this city where only soldiers were left, it was very rare to see such civilian attire. The streets in the northern suburbs of Mart City gradually sloped down, following the sinking terrain and slowly entering a heavily guarded fortification. 3 Empire scouts handed the hooded man to the military police, who saluted the man and then politely invited him into the fortification. After entering the Empire's frontline headquarters, the high-ranking officers inside knew more than the soldiers in the city. They could vaguely guess the identity of this man. Although no one dared to kneel down and greet him, both the generals and the lieutenants made way for him, respectfully waiting at the side with their heads lowered. Pushing open the dark alloy door in the deepest part of the headquarters, Su Lu nodded slightly to express his gratitude to the military police beside him. He walked in, then turned around and closed the door. The heavy and cold feeling coming from the alloy door allowed him to confirm in a very short time that this seemingly ordinary office could definitely be as stable as a mountain under the concentrated attacks of the main cannons of the Federation's battleships. Countless documents were piled up on the desk, like countless mountains of rocks that were about to collapse. On the side, 2 of the Empire's most advanced workstations were flashing with data, reflecting a strange feeling in the dark room. The person behind the pile of documents heard the sound of the door closing and slowly raised his head. Huai Chaoshi rubbed her tired forehead, looked at Su Lu and said, "Although I am very willing to see you, you should be very clear about the situation on Mo Hua Planet. The last mecha team in the Straits battle zone is fighting alone. My most urgent task now is to think of a way to save them. I'm sorry to disturb you under such circumstances," Su Lu said, "but I need some information now. Without your signature, no one in the military will agree to my request even though I have that electronic ID chip. Of course I know you're not here to fight for the Empire." Huai Chaoshi turned and walked to the coffee machine in the corner of the room. She poured 2 cups of coffee and put them in the narrow corner of the mountain of documents. She looked at him and said with slight mockery, "What information do you want?" "The team you sent to the southwest graphite mine was ambushed by the federal forces many days ago. That team was under your direct command. They must have a very important mission in the southwest graphite mine. I want to know the return route of this team and the exact location of the ambush." Huai Chaoshi tapped the coffee on the table with her index finger and motioned for him to help himself. She asked, "I remember you said in Mulberry Town that you wouldn't come to Mo Hua Planet, so your arrival surprised me. What I want to know now is what relationship my direct guard has with you." "I don't know if you still remember, Paul. When I was escaping from the Empire, I lived in his house for more than half a year. Now he is an ordinary officer in the Royal Guards and has been on the list of missing persons. According to the information I found, he should have disappeared in that ambush. After a slight pause, he continued, there were many soldiers and soldiers who died in that ambush, and the bodies have been counted, but there was no sign of him. Then he was either captured by the federal forces or lost in that war zone. Sail City. I'll have someone bring you the specific information. Huai Chaoshi gave the answer directly, then dialed a phone number and said a few words. Then she looked at him quietly, frowning slightly, and said, the problem is that there are many people like him who are missing. Some of the Empire's soldiers may be waiting for support on the flooded cliff. It is unfair and unreasonable to send troops to search for him because of personal relationships. It is indeed unfair for a field commander or superior to risk more deaths to save a soldier who may have died long ago, but I am not his superior. Su Lu replied, my idea is very simple. If he is still alive, I want to take him back and bring him to Auntie, and I don't need your troops to help me find me. The information of Sail City will take some time. Huai Chaoshi motioned for him to sit down, still frowning, and said, I heard that you have met with father, so don't you understand that as long as you are willing, all the troops in the left Sky Star region are yours. You can have more power to do what you want to do, to protect those you want to protect. Su Lu replied, the greater the power, the greater the damage. Overlooking this planet from space, looking at those flames in the night, I am more and more certain that I do not have the ability to accept this ability calmly and use it well. The 3 consecutive abilities were somewhat long-winded, but they fell into Huai Caoshi's ears clearly. She looked at her only brother quietly and asked, so you refused the invitation of the rebel organization, and even though their goals seem to coincide with your ideas, you are not willing to be emperor. This is the other important question I want to talk to you about. Su Lu looked at his only sister calmly and said, I heard of a concept from them called the Republic of the False Monarchs. If you are interested, you can take a look at the related works after the war. Whether it is called the Republic of the False Monarchs or the Constitution of the Monarchs, it has no practical meaning. Huai Chaoshi calmly revealed the profound knowledge hidden behind her ordinary appearance and terrifying martial strength. Besides, neither you nor I know how long this war will last. It is meaningless to talk about reform now. But you should know that the left Sky Star region does not have a charter. It is impossible to control such a vast empire. The bloody suppression and the strict hierarchy can only be maintained for a while, not forever. Otherwise, the imperial family would not have thought of reforming these decades. If this continues, there will come a day when the imperial family will be chased out of power by the angry masses, hanged on the gallows, and disappear from history. Su Lu knew that there were not many chances to talk to Huai Chaoshi like this, and he had to cherish the moment when he could influence the future empress of the empire, so his words were extremely direct, even somewhat impolite. Can't we withdraw from the stage of history like the Tai family of the Federation? This is a happy ending for everyone. Huai Chaoshi looked at him with a smile that was not a smile. She sighed softly and said, you once admitted that you are an idiot in politics, so I don't understand why you are teaching me a lesson today. The current environment of the empire is different from that of the Tai dynasty of the past, so the methods that can be used are naturally different. You should have seen Prince Jin Zhang, who is temporarily managing the intelligence bureau on behalf of me. She retracted her smile and said seriously, do you know how many young and ambitious imperial family members like him are on Tianjing planet? Do you think that these people are willing to give up their status and interests just to embrace the bright and free future of the left Sky Star region? And that the bright future will be their darkness? Huai Chaoshi slowly stood up. Her body was thin and not tall, but it gave people a strong sense of oppression. She looked at Su Lu and said calmly, the blood of the Bai Yan Huai family is filled with stubbornness and pride. Before we are killed by the enemy, we will never surrender. Regardless of whether it is Prince De Lin who died in your hands, or my uncle who jumped from the Zhai Xing palace, or even yourself, they have all proven this. Do you know why no one in the current imperial family dares to challenge the orthodox? It is because my father is strong enough, and I am strong enough. Even if I am the only one left in the end, I am strong enough. Once I accept your suggestion and use those false political terms to bind my hands and feet, announcing my weakness to the entire left sky star region, then my strength will be greatly reduced. Many people like Prince Jin Zhang will come out to challenge me and my father. Su Luo was silent for a long time, seriously thinking about the meaning behind White Xiaoshi's words. In the end, he could only shake his head. He was not disappointed, but he felt that these things were really tiresome. An officer knocked on the door and brought in the information Su Luo wanted. Huai Chaoshi looked at him, who was quickly flipping through the information, and suddenly said, "It is rare for you to take the initiative to mention these things. I keep feeling that it is a bit strange. Let me guess, are you preparing to return to the Federation?" "It is possible." Su Luo stood up and replied. "Why do you want to go back?" Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes slightly and asked, "Could it be that you still have fantasies about those hypocrites?" Su Luo was silent for a long time. Then, he scratched his head awkwardly and said, "If I say that I want to return to the Federation to end this war, would you think that it is ridiculous?" Hearing these words, White Xiaoshi's narrowed eyes slowly relaxed. Her dark eyes, which were like the center of a nebula vortex, gradually brightened and revealed a trace of a smile. She said in a low voice, "It is indeed ridiculous." Before saying goodbye, the brother and sister hugged again. Their movements felt as clumsy and unnatural as the last hug. The most powerful pair of brother and sister in the world still needed some time to get used to being together like a family. Fortunately, they were still very young, so there was still a lot of time. It was the beautiful season of early autumn, when the air was clear and the red leaves were everywhere. However, the lead-like heavy clouds in the sky squeezed out snow. The snowflakes were stained with smoke and dust that floated everywhere. The edges of the snowflakes were gray and black, extremely ugly. The forward base of the Federation forces on planet Mo Hua was shrouded in this strange snowflakes. They had just won a great battle, and the battle zone in the straits was still constantly sending in news of victory. However, the soldiers were already so tired and numb that they no longer had the stamina or the mood to have a snowball fight. In a certain room in the headquarters that was in a state of high alert, Lieutenant General Hu Yan, who had replaced Du Shaoqing as the commander-in-chief of the enemy in the Federation, looked at the officer in front of him with a gloomy expression and roared, "Colonel Li Feng is still fighting a bloody battle in the Straits battle zone, and those 4 heroic mechanic teams are fighting in the Southwest battle zone. At a time like this, you actually have the face and guts to command a portion of the troops to rescue one of your teams." He suppressed the anger in his heart and pleaded, "Commander, my NTR team has been lost in the enemy zone for almost 2 months. If we don't think of a way to rescue them, they will be finished." You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.